Section 1. The nuclear power plant is poisoning everyone. Take a breath, get comfortable. Settle into wherever you are right now because for the next little while, we are going somewhere familiar. We are going to Springfield. You know Springfield. You have always known Springfield. It is the most famous fictional town in the history of American television. A place so deeply embedded in the cultural imagination that millions of people can picture its skyline, its streets, and its residents more vividly than they can picture the actual town they grew up in. There is a nuclear power plant on the hill. There is a quick E-Mart on the corner. There is a yellow family in a house on Evergreen Terrace. And none of them, not a single one, has aged a single day since the 17th of December, 1989, the night the show first aired. 36 seasons, 788 episodes. The longest-running American animated series. The longest-running sitcom. The longest-running scripted primetime show in all of television history. And in every single one of those episodes, across every decade, through every cultural shift and every world event and every technological revolution, Bart Simpson has been 10 years old, Lisa has been 8, Maggie has been sucking on that same pacifier, Homer has been going to the same job, working for the same boss, eating the same donuts, and coming home to the same house on the same quiet street. But here's the thing about familiarity. The longer you sit with something, the more you stop seeing it. You stop noticing the details. You stop asking questions. You stop looking at the fluorescent glow of that cooling tower on the horizon and wondering what exactly it has been doing to the people who live in its shadow for the past 3.5 decades. Tonight, we are going to start looking again. We are going to go slowly. We are going to let each mystery breathe. We are going to follow the threads one at a time, all the way back to their source. And the first thread, the one that everything else eventually leads back to, begins with the building that sits at the center of Springfield's economy, its power grid, and arguably its entire reality. The Springfield nuclear power plant. Let us start there, in the quiet hours before the morning shift, when the cooling towers send their pale columns of steam into the night sky and the town sleeps beneath them, breathing the air that comes down from those cracked walls. Let us start with what we actually know about this place. The Springfield nuclear power plant is described in the show's own canon as a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the wealthiest man in Springfield and, by most estimates, one of the wealthiest individuals in the fictional state in which Springfield exists. The plant provides electrical power to the entire town. Every light that flickers on in Springfield, every television humming in the evening, every refrigerator keeping the Duff beer cold, all of it runs through the plant. Now, a nuclear power plant providing electricity to a town is not unusual. There are over 400 commercial nuclear reactors operating around the world. They are, when properly maintained and regulated, among the safest forms of power generation that humanity has developed. The key phrase there is properly maintained. The Springfield plant is not properly maintained. It has not been properly maintained for a very long time, possibly ever. The first real window we get into the plant's actual condition comes during a surprise safety inspection. The results are staggering. The inspection turns up 342 separate safety violations. Not 3, not a dozen, 342 individual problems, each one a documented deviation from the standards that exist to keep a nuclear facility from becoming a disaster zone. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code is $56 million. That is not an insignificant amount of money, but it is also not an impossible amount. For a man of Burns's wealth, it is manageable. For a man who once blocked out the sun over an entire town as a business strategy, it is rounding error. Burns refuses to spend it. He does not refuse because the money is not there. He refuses because spending it would require acknowledging that the violations exist, and acknowledging that the violations exist would invite the obvious follow-up question. What, exactly, have these violations already done? To the water table, to the soil, to the fish in the rivers downstream, to the people who have been living within the radiation perimeter of this facility for decades. And that question is one Burns cannot afford to answer. The violations the show actually depicts are not minor administrative paperwork failures. The show takes care to describe them in specific, visceral terms. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into the bodies of water that flow through and around Springfield. Radioactive material being left on children's playgrounds. plutonium being used as a paperweight on someone's desk inside a working office, cracked cooling towers that have been patched not with industry-standard materials but with chewing gum, actual chewing gum pressed into the cracks by someone who could not be bothered to do anything more permanent. Rats running through the lower levels of the facility that glow visibly in the dark, their bodies so saturated with radioactive material that they emit light of their own. And then there is the detail that the show drops so casually that you could almost miss it if you are not paying attention. Human skeletons in the basement. Not the bones of an animal. Not some symbolic image. Human skeletal remains discovered in the basement of an active nuclear power plant. The show presents this without explanation, follows it with no investigation, and moves on. The inspector notes it. The camera lingers on the bones for a moment, and then the scene continues. No one asks who those people were. No one asks how they got there. No one asks what happened to them, or how long they have been down in those walls. Springfield just absorbs it, accepts it, moves on. The person responsible for preventing all of this, the man whose literal job description is to stand between the Springfield nuclear power plant and a catastrophic failure that could poison the surrounding region, is Homer Simpson. Homer is the plant's safety inspector. He has held this position for decades, and the show is not shy about what that means in practical terms. Homer sleeps at his workstation regularly. He has been depicted eating donuts during emergency meltdown warnings. He once caused an actual nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see if it would grow. He carries a coffee mug that the show implies he has never washed. His response time to alarms is measured not in seconds but in sleep cycles. The show's own creator has stated that Homer has an IQ of 55, a clinical disability by most medical standards, a level of cognitive impairment that in the real world would raise serious questions about whether a person could be legally employed in a capacity involving nuclear oversight. And the show adds another layer to this in a much later episode, when it's revealed that Homer has been living his entire life with a crayon lodged in his brain, a foreign object that has been physically suppressing his cognitive function since childhood. When the crayon is finally removed, Homer's intelligence surges. He becomes articulate, insightful, capable. He starts connecting dots that he has never been able to connect before. But that comes later. For now, Homer is the safety inspector, and the plant is leaking, and the town is living downwind of all of it. The first visible consequence of the plant's contamination appears in the show's second season, and it arrives in a form so vivid that it should have ended the debate immediately. It should have prompted federal investigations, emergency environmental assessments, and a very hard conversation about what exactly the Springfield nuclear power plant has been releasing into the local ecosystem. Instead, it becomes a news story for about 48 hours and then disappears from the town's collective memory. The consequence is Blinky. Blinky is a fish, a three-eyed fish pulled from a river near the plant, caught by Homer Simpson in an episode that plays the discovery mostly for comedy. But for a moment, just a moment, the show lets the implications surface. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as campaign evidence. He holds up this three-eyed fish and says, plainly, that it is proof of what the nuclear plant is doing to the environment. The biology is not complicated. Three-eyed fish do not occur in nature. Radiation causes genetic mutation. The plant sits upstream. The fish has 3 eyes. The math is not hard. Burns's response is not to clean up the contamination. His response is to appear on live television and eat Blinky. He eats the three-eyed fish in front of cameras and the watching public in an act of pure theater designed to demonstrate that the fish is perfectly safe to consume and therefore that the plant is perfectly safe to live near. His aide immediately spits the fish out off camera. Burns can barely keep it down. The town watches the spectacle, shrugs, and moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody follows up on the fish study. Nobody asks the single most obvious question that the entire situation demands. If the radiation is doing this to the fish, what is it doing to the people who have been drinking the same water? The answer has been embedded in the show since at least season 8, in an episode called The Springfield Files, which is one of those episodes that the more you examine it, the more unsettling it becomes. The premise is that Homer, walking through the woods near Springfield one evening, sees something he cannot explain. A glowing figure, moving oddly, emitting light from its body. Homer reports it as an alien sighting. The town panics. FBI agents Mulder and Scully are called in one of the show's famous real-world crossovers, and an investigation begins. The episode builds steadily toward a reveal, and when the reveal comes, it lands differently depending on how seriously you have been taking the show's internal logic. The alien is not an alien. The glowing figure in the woods is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with radiation therapy and experimental chemicals, that after each session, his body emits a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him functional for exactly 1 more week. Without the next dose, he deteriorates. His biological systems begin to fail. The only thing keeping Charles Montgomery Burns alive and ambulatory is a scheduled, recurring, high-intensity medical intervention that has to happen every 7 days without exception. And after each treatment, Burns wanders out of the medical facility in a dazed, euphoric state, his body glowing, his movements strange, his consciousness somewhere between sleep and waking. He stumbles through the woods near Springfield like a creature that has never learned how to walk properly, and the glow he emits is visible in the darkness. Homer sees this figure and concludes it must be an extraterrestrial being. Not the nuclear plant. Not radiation. An alien from outer space. That is the depth of the denial we are talking about. Springfield has been living so long under the influence of whatever the plant has been releasing that the sight of their own employer glowing in the dark does not trigger the obvious association. The cooling towers are right there. The contamination reports are right there. The three-eyed fish were right there. And the town looks at a man emitting radiation and thinks, probably a visitor from another galaxy. The Simpsons movie, which arrived in 2007 and represents the single largest canvas the show has ever had to work with, takes all of this ambient contamination and pushes it to its logical extreme. Springfield's environmental situation reaches such a critical point that the EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal regulatory body operating within the show's universe, determines that the only viable solution is to seal the town under a dome. A massive glass dome, lowered over the entirety of Springfield and sealed to prevent the town's pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. Sit with that for a moment. The United States government, using the resources of a federal environmental agency, looks at Springfield and concludes that the town is so fundamentally contaminated, so saturated with pollution and toxic runoff and nuclear material, that physical containment is the only appropriate response. They do not propose cleanup efforts. They do not propose a remediation program. They propose putting the town in a jar. And every resident of Springfield is inside the jar when it goes up. Every person who has been drinking that water, every person who has been breathing that air, every child who played on that playground where the radioactive waste was dumped, every family who ate the fish from the river downstream of the cooling towers, all of them are sealed inside with whatever has already been done to them. Now look at the residents themselves. Look carefully at what they actually look like. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that does not correspond to human anatomy. His cranium is enlarged in ways that real biology cannot explain. His eyes bulge slightly from their sockets. His overbite is pronounced. He has 4 fingers on each hand, not 5, 4. His IQ, as established, sits at the clinical disability threshold, and his body absorbs physical trauma that would kill an ordinary person without apparent lasting damage. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted. He has fallen from heights that would shatter bone. He has been hit by cars, been in explosions, survived being ejected from vehicles at high speed. His healing is not normal. His pain tolerance is not normal. His physical durability is not remotely within the range of baseline human biology. And he has been working in direct proximity to an active reactor core for the entirety of his adult life. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4-fingered hands, hair that violates several laws of physics simultaneously, rising straight up from her head in a blue tower that she has maintained in the exact same configuration for 36 years. Marge was briefly employed at the plant as well, which means she was directly exposed to whatever Homer is exposed to every day, on top of living in the contaminated town and drinking the contaminated water. The children Bart, Lisa, Maggie were all born after both parents had already spent years absorbing Springfield's environment, and every single one of them displays physical characteristics that do not occur in healthy human populations. The spiky hair that holds its shape without any product, the overbites, the eyes, the yellow skin, the yellow skin. Every single resident of Springfield has yellow skin. And here is where the radiation theory clicks into place with an elegance that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. When outside characters visit Springfield, when guest stars and celebrities and people from other towns appear in the show, they look different. Their proportions are more anatomically plausible. Their features are closer to what actual human faces look like. Their eyes sit in their skulls at the correct depth. Their skin is not yellow. The show's standard explanation for this has always been that the art style of The Simpsons simply gives everyone yellow skin and exaggerated features. That is how the show looks. That is the animation convention. But within the show's own universe, within the logic of a world where the characters are supposed to be real people living real lives, there is an observable, visible, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who come from outside Springfield. The people inside the contamination zone have yellow skin, 4 fingers, bulging eyes, and physiological resilience that should not be possible. The people outside it look, by comparison, normal. Animals are not exempt. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family's greyhound, has the same proportional abnormalities as the human residents. The same eyes, the same slightly wrong geometry. Even the dog is affected. Blinky the fish had 3 eyes. The wildlife is demonstrably mutated. The show tells you this directly. It shows you a 3-eyed fish and labels it as the product of radioactive contamination, and then it expects you to accept that the radiation has had absolutely no visible effect on the humans living in the same environment. And Burns knows. This is the part of the theory that carries the most weight, because it is not fan speculation, it is written directly into the show's canon across multiple episodes. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians who are not accessible to ordinary Springfield residents. He undergoes weekly treatments, as we discussed, that manage the effects of his own radiation exposure. Burns understands what radiation does to biological systems better than anyone in Springfield, because radiation is the mechanism keeping him alive. He has spent over a century managing the relationship between his body and nuclear material. He knows what chronic low-level exposure does over time. He knows what it does to cognition. He knows what it does to cellular structure. He knows what it does to the immune system. He knows what his plant is doing to Springfield. And Homer's continued employment at the plant is, in this reading, not a mistake. It is not Burns being forgetful or negligent or absent-minded about personnel decisions. It is strategy. The show demonstrates this with unusual clarity in an episode where a group of German investors temporarily purchases the plant. The first thing they do is fire Homer immediately. No deliberation, no second chances. Homer is obviously demonstrably unsuitable for his position, and any competent management team can see it in minutes. The Germans fire Homer and then begin the process of assessing what it would actually cost to bring the facility up to regulatory standards. The estimate nearly bankrupts them. Burns buys the plant back. Burns immediately rehires Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut that facility down. Homer ensures that the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking, the contamination keeps spreading, the water stays poisoned, and Burns maintains his monopoly over the town's power supply, its economy, and through those things, its population. A population too impaired by decades of radiation exposure, by compromised cognition, by the slow erosion of whatever critical thinking capacity they might have had to look up at those cracked cooling towers and ask the most basic question a sentient creature can formulate. Why are we all like this? The crayon in Homer's brain, which seems like one of the show's stranger one-off premises, becomes something much darker in this context. The episode establishes that Homer had this crayon lodged in his skull since childhood. He had been visiting Springfield doctors throughout his entire life, childhood checkups, adult physicals, hospitalizations, all of it, and not one of those medical professionals ever found a foreign object in his skull. Not one of them noticed. Either every doctor in Springfield is so catastrophically incompetent that they could miss a crayon on a standard examination, which would be alarming in its own right, or someone knew it was there and chose not to remove it, or the medical establishment in Springfield is operating under influences that are not purely medical in nature. If Burns's reach extends into the town's healthcare infrastructure, and it does extend into the town's economic infrastructure, its political infrastructure, its regulatory infrastructure, then the Springfield medical community looking the other way, while a man walks around with a crayon, suppressing his brain function is not that far a stretch. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains. something that keeps them compliant, something that keeps them from looking up. And the most terrifying possibility is that this is not an accident. It is the outcome of a system designed to produce exactly this result. The radiation theory, when you lay it out fully, does not just explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them simultaneously. The characters not aging is explained by mutated biology operating outside normal cellular aging processes. The town resetting after catastrophic events is explained by a population whose memory function and critical thinking have been chronically impaired. Homer's miraculous physical durability is explained by a body that has adapted to radiation exposure in ways that make it nearly indestructible but cognitively devastated. Burns's impossible longevity is explained by his access to treatments that nobody else in town can afford or access. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town where strange things happen because the writers thought they would be funny. Springfield is a contamination zone where the strangeness is a symptom, where the yellow skin is evidence, where the four fingers are data, where every impossible recovery and every forgotten catastrophe and every character who should logically be dead but isn't all traced back to the same source. The cracked cooling towers leaking invisible poison into the water supply, feeding the same damaged brains that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have 4 fingers. The nuclear power plant is not a background element in The Simpsons. It is not set dressing, it is the engine driving everything. It is the cause behind the effects. Every mystery, every contradiction, every impossible thing that happens in Springfield and gets absorbed without comment, it all has the same return address. And nobody in Springfield will ever figure it out, because the plant made sure of that a long time ago. If you're enjoying this so far, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe so you never miss one. Section 2. The Homer Coma Theory. What if everything we just talked about is real, but only inside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since 1993? That is not a hypothetical. That is the foundation of what is probably the most analyzed fan theory in the history of The Simpsons, and possibly in the history of American television. It is called the Homer Coma Theory, and once you have heard it laid out properly, certain episodes of this show become very difficult to watch the same way again. Let us go back to the spring of 1993, to Season 4, to an episode that aired on April 1st of that year. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. It was presented as a light, comedic episode built around a premise of family pranks. Bart has been playing April Fool's Day jokes on Homer throughout the day, escalating with each one, until he goes one step too far. He takes one of Homer's cans of Duff beer to an auto body shop and puts it inside an industrial paint shaker. He shakes it until the contents are under extraordinary pressure. He puts it back in the refrigerator. He waits. Homer finds the beer. Homer opens the beer. The explosion sends Homer to the hospital with significant injuries. The Simpson family gathers around his hospital bed. The episode establishes this as a real medical event, not a cutaway, not a gag, an actual hospitalization. And then, while Homer is lying in that hospital bed, he sees a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He gets up, reaches for the machine, and the machine tips over and falls on him. Homer Simpson flatlines. He enters a coma. The episode eventually shows Homer waking up, Bart tearfully confessing at his bedside, Homer lurching upright and grabbing Bart by the throat in his characteristic fashion, and the family laughing. Everything goes back to normal. Homer is awake. The show moves on, but in the final moments of that episode, there is a detail so quietly devastating that the show slides it past the audience almost without emphasis. Homer is told that during the coma he suffered permanent brain damage. 5% of his brain function was destroyed. 5% of Homer's brain, already operating at a fraction of normal capacity, is simply gone. Lost. Not healing, not recovering, just gone. Homer's response to learning this is to laugh. He says he does not know why he is laughing, but he keeps laughing. The family smiles. The episode ends. And here is where the theory begins. The Reddit user who first articulated this most clearly, writing under the name Hard Topic a Name, proposed a reading of this episode that changes everything that comes after it. The argument is not complicated. Homer did not wake up from that coma in April 1993. What the show presents as his awakening is actually the first moment of his coma dream, his unconscious mind constructing the most comforting narrative it could assemble from the emotional raw material it had available. Every episode of The Simpsons that has aired since that date, every storyline, every guest appearance, every impossible adventure, every moment of chaos and resolution and reset is a dream being generated by a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield, General. His brain slowly losing the battle it has been fighting since the vending machine fell on him. The evidence that supports this reading is substantial enough that it has survived 30 years of scrutiny without falling apart. Start with the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons operated in a register that was broadly recognizable as satire of everyday middle-class American life. Homer tried to quit drinking. Marge navigated the competing pressures of motherhood and her own ambitions. Lisa struggled to find her place in a family that did not always know how to appreciate her. Bart faced genuine academic consequences and real uncertainty about his future. These were not small, realistic stories. This was always a cartoon, and the comedy was always exaggerated, but the emotional and narrative machinery was built on situations that real families could recognize. Financial stress, marital strain, the particular loneliness of being the smart kid in a family of ordinary people, the fear of failing your children. The concerns were human, the stakes were domestic. After the coma episode, the show's reality shifts dramatically. Homer goes to space. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers his mother, who he believed was dead, is actually a fugitive radical who has been hiding from the FBI for decades. Homer meets God. Homer meets God again. Homer travels internationally with implausible frequency, visiting dozens of countries and somehow being central to events in each of them. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs across hundreds of different episodes. Homer befriends more celebrities than most celebrities encounter in their careers. Homer survives physical trauma that should have ended him dozens of times over, and he survives it with a cheerfulness that suggests he is not quite experiencing the same version of reality that the laws of physics describe. Fans have argued about when The Simpsons changed for decades. The internet has debated the quality shift endlessly, producing comprehensive analyses of which season marked the turning point, which writers' room decisions altered the show's DNA, which specific episode represents the moment the original Simpsons ended and something else began. The coma theory proposes that the answer is not a judgment about quality at all, it is a medical event. The Simpsons did not get worse. Homer's brain got worse. And as the brain deteriorates, as whatever is keeping Homer's unconscious mind running slowly loses its coherence, the dream it generates becomes less grounded, more fantastical, more willing to abandon the rules it set for itself earlier. The escalation of the show's absurdity is not a writing failure. It is a symptom. Now go back 6 months before the coma. Go back to the Season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic, which aired in October 1992. Homer, in this episode, has a direct face-to-face conversation with God. Not a symbolic dream sequence. Not an ambiguous vision. An actual conversation with a deity who appears to Homer with a face and a voice and specific things to say. And one of the things God says to Homer during this conversation is that Homer will someday learn the meaning of life, but not yet, that Homer's time is coming. God tells Homer his time is coming. 6 months later, a vending machine falls on Homer Simpson, and he enters a coma. The timeline is not coincidental under the coma theory. It is a prophecy. The show's own God, operating within the show's own canon, told Homer in October 1992 that his time was approaching, that there was something ahead of him that would change everything. The audience heard this as a theological joke, a quirky gag about the show's willingness to include divine characters in its satire. But under the coma reading, God was telling Homer that his waking life was nearly over, that the last chapter of his conscious experience was already underway, that the next time they would speak, if there was a next time, it would be in a different kind of place. 6 months later, Homer's waking life ends, and the dream begins. The aging problem is where the coma theory is most elegant, most precise, most difficult to argue with. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Every theory that touches the show eventually has to reckon with this fact. The radiation theory explains it through mutated biology. The cartoon logic explanation says it is simply how animated shows are structured. The Flintstones never aged either, nor did the Jetsons, nor did 100 other animated families before and after The Simpsons. The floating timeline explanation says that the characters are always contemporary with their audience, that the show's present is always the viewer's present, and that aging is simply not part of that agreement. But none of these explanations carry the emotional weight of the coma theory's answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer went to sleep in April 1993. His children were the ages they were. His wife looked the way she looked. His friends were exactly the people they were on the last day he saw them with conscious eyes. And in the coma, they stay that way. Of course they do. His brain cannot imagine them aging because he was not there to see it happen. He never saw Bart turn 11 or Lisa turn 9. He never watched Maggie take her first real steps. He never watched Marge get a gray hair or a new line around her eyes. His brain has no material to work with. It has only the versions of these people it knew when the lights went out, and so those versions are the ones it keeps generating, episode after episode, in an endless loop. The celebrity appearances that became such a defining feature of the show's later seasons make unsettling sense in this framework. A coma patient's brain does not operate in silence. The hospital room is full of ambient noise, televisions in adjacent rooms, conversations at the nurse's station, family members talking beside the bed, radio from somewhere down the hall. Names float in, voices drift through, cultural references filter through the fog. Homer's unconscious mind catches fragments of these sounds and weaves them into the dream. This is why later seasons are flooded with famous faces, because Homer's brain, lying in that bed for years, is absorbing media. It hears a name on the television. It recognizes a voice from the radio. It incorporates the signal into the dream. And suddenly there is a celebrity in Springfield, perfectly integrated into the story, familiar to the audience watching from outside the dream in ways they cannot quite articulate. Every celebrity who shows up in Springfield is a sound that Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, translated by a dreaming brain into a dream character. The show has engaged with this theory directly, which is its own kind of acknowledgement. In season 34, an episode called Lisa, the Boy Scout, included a scene that was leaked before broadcast, and that showed Homer waking from a long coma with a caption indicating that all the outlandish episodes had been his dream. The scene was subsequently revealed to have been planted, deliberately described as a fake deleted scene inserted by hackers, and the show insisted it was not canonical. But the show made it. The writers animated it. They produced a version of the scene, in the show's visual language, depicting the exact conclusion that the coma theory proposes, and then they showed it to the audience and said it was a joke. The fact that they made it says something. The writers know about the theory. They have engaged with it enough to produce a response to it. Their denial is real. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015 and said it is not true, but what Jean did not address was the evidence. He did not explain the tonal shift. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the conversation with God 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show becomes progressively more surreal and detached from its own internal logic with each passing season, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dream generated by a brain that is slowly losing coherence. He said it is not true. The interviewer moved on. The theory did not, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever managed to do. It makes everything make sense. All of it, simultaneously, without needing to invoke cartoon logic or production convenience, or the simple assertion that some things are just not meant to be examined too closely. Homer can survive anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him, because his mind is the one telling the story. The show resets between episodes, consequences evaporate, catastrophes are forgotten, the world returns to its baseline configuration no matter how dramatically it was disrupted, because that is what dreams do between cycles. Each episode is a new dream. Each new dream begins fresh, with the characters restored and the world rebuilt and the emotional logic of the previous cycle set aside. The escalating strangeness of later seasons is the dream becoming less stable as the dreamer deteriorates. The physics of Springfield become more cartoonish. The plots become more disconnected from any recognizable version of reality. The emotional stakes become harder to feel as genuine, because the brain generating this dream is not the brain it was in 1993. 5% of it is already gone, and whatever remains is working harder and harder to keep the simulation running on less and less. And here's the part that lingers longest after you have heard the theory. If the coma theory is true, if Homer has been dreaming since 1993, if every episode since that April night is the product of a mind refusing to let go, then the show's emotional core is not comedy. It is something much quieter and much more devastating. Homer's deepest wish is not complicated. It is not ambitious. It is not the wish of a person who wants power or recognition or wealth or adventure. Homer's wish is the wish of a man who loves his family and is terrified of losing them. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, infuriating, warm-hearted boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone in the bedroom at the end of the hallway. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants Friday night at the Simpson house to last forever, the television on, the beer cold, the family together, nobody older and nobody gone. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives him everything he wants and asks for nothing in return. His family is preserved exactly as he left them. The children never grow up. Marge never leaves. The house on Evergreen Terrace never changes. The life that was taken from him by a falling vending machine in April 1993 continues episode after episode for 30 more years. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only version of heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. And every time the credits roll and everything resets and the family goes back to normal, every time Homer survives something impossible and wakes up on his couch and the world continues unchanged, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, the dream ends. And ending the dream means one of two things. Either Homer wakes up and has to discover how much time has actually passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting beside him in that hospital room, whether the life he was dreaming about is still there to go back to, or whether it moved on without him. Or Homer does not wake up at all. The show will never confirm the coma theory. The writers have made that clear. But the show cannot disprove it either, because the evidence for it is built into the architecture of the show itself, not in any single episode but in the pattern of what the show became after April 1993. In the way it changed. In the way it has kept changing. In the way it keeps presenting an increasingly surreal and impossible Springfield with the serene confidence of a sleeping man who does not know he is dreaming. Homer is still in that hospital room. The family still comes to visit. The television is on in the corner. And on that television, Homer Simpson is going on another impossible adventure with his impossible family in an impossible town where nobody ever gets older and nothing ever really ends. Because in his dream, they are together. And as long as they are together, Homer does not have to wake up. As long as the dream is running, the story continues. And the story continuing means Homer is still there, somewhere between the breathing machine and the window and the muted sounds of the hospital corridor. Still dreaming about the family he loves, still coming home. Number section 3, Who Really Shot Mr. Burns? Let us go back to the summer of 1995. It was a different era of television. The Simpsons was in its commercial peak, regularly pulling audiences in the tens of millions, and it was broadly understood to be the most influential comedy on American broadcast television. The show had done things no animated series had ever attempted: serious emotional stories, complicated characters, social satire with genuine bite, but it had never done anything quite like what it was about to do. In May of 1995, the 6th season finale aired. It was called Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. And The Simpsons pulled off something that had never been attempted in the history of American animation. A genuine whodunit. A real cliffhanger mystery. A puzzle constructed with deliberate care that the show invited its audience to solve. Fox promoted the event like a cultural happening. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted that treated the fictional crime as an actual unsolved case, complete with investigators and timelines, and the very earnest suggestion that the audience at home might be able to help crack it. A national contest was announced. Submit your guess for the shooter, and the winner chosen from entries that got the correct answer would be animated into a future episode of the show. America played along. Millions of people watched the finale, argued about the evidence, submitted their theories. The summer of 1995 had a genuine cultural mystery running through it, and the mystery was set in a cartoon. But before we get to the reveal, we need to understand the crime. Burns had, by the end of Part 1, done something remarkable even by his standards. He had gone further than stealing money or corrupting a city council member or using his economic leverage to squeeze the town's residents. He had moved into apocalyptic territory. He stole the sun. Not metaphorically. Burns built a giant mechanical disc, a device large enough to block sunlight from reaching Springfield, and he positioned it over the town. His plan was that if Springfield could not get sunlight, if the crops could not grow and the solar panels could not charge, and the people could not depend on any energy source that did not run through a power line, then everyone in Springfield would have to buy their electricity from his plant. He would have a complete monopoly not just over the town's power grid, but over its access to energy in any form. He would own Springfield's relationship with light itself. Before he activated the device, Burns systematically dismantled the lives of nearly everyone in the town. He stole an oil deposit from beneath Springfield Elementary School, destroying the school's budget and eliminating arts programs and resources that the children depended on. He manipulated financial circumstances to bankrupt Moe's Tavern. His construction project caused a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle. His guards injured Santa's little helper. He fired Smithers, his own right hand, his most loyal employee, the man who had dedicated his entire professional life to keeping Burns alive and functional because Smithers had the audacity to object to the sun-blocking plan on moral grounds. By the time Burns collapsed from a gunshot wound at the town sundial, every single person in Springfield had a reason to want him dead. The show had been careful about this. It had taken its time building motive after motive, making sure that the audience could look at any of a dozen characters and construct a plausible case for their guilt. Homer, because Burns had spent years failing to remember his name despite Homer being his direct employee for the entirety of his adult working life. The humiliation had been building into something that looked, in part one, very much like a breaking point. Bart and Lisa, because the school funding had been destroyed. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home had been rendered structurally uninhabitable. Groundskeeper Willie, who had lost his job. Tito Puente, the musician, because the music program that was his livelihood had been cut. Moe, because his bar was gone. Even Smithers, who had just been fired by the man he had given everything to, and who was shown in the episode's final act in a state of obvious psychological deterioration. Burns was shot. He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two letters as he collapsed, a W and an S. Or, depending on which direction you read from Burns's perspective rather than the camera's an M and an S, the screen went dark. America waited. When Part 2 aired in September of that year, the investigation played out as a parody of procedural crime drama. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield Police Department moved through the case with their characteristic blend of aggression and incompetence. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession fell apart when it emerged that he had been blackout drunk during the relevant window and had actually shot someone else entirely. A secondary character named Old Jasper in his wooden leg, nowhere near the scene of the Burns shooting. One by one, suspects were eliminated. Alibis were established. Tito Puente delivered perhaps the greatest alibi in television history, a full musical number explaining that he had channeled his rage into the creation of a samba rather than violence. The investigation stalled, and then police found a key piece of evidence on Burns's clothing, an eyelash. Forensic analysis determined that the eyelash belonged to a member of the Simpson family. The evidence pointed toward Homer. His fingerprints were on the weapon. He had the clearest motive, the specific, personal, years-long humiliation of being unable to get his own boss to remember his name. He was arrested. He was about to be convicted, and then Burns woke up from his coma and identified the shooter. It was Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson, 1-year-old, incapable of speech, unable to walk without falling. Burns's account was that he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He had attempted to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun went off. "Case closed," said the Springfield legal system. "No jury in the world," said Chief Wiggum, "would convict a baby. Except maybe Texas," he added. And that was the end of it. Maggie was identified as the shooter. Homer was released. The mystery was solved. Springfield moved on. Except the contest that Fox had run, the national contest that invited viewers to guess the correct answer, had essentially no winners. According to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person from the randomly selected pool of entries had guessed Maggie. The prize was awarded to someone chosen at random from the pool, and because that person had not given the correct answer, They received a cash payment rather than the promised animated appearance. The show's writers noted on the commentary that they were aware of one individual who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup on the night of the original broadcast. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest concluded and producers attempted to track them down, the account had been deactivated. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward and claim their prize. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think carefully about what this means. The show's creators designed a solvable mystery. They promoted it explicitly as solvable. They told the audience that the clues in Part 1 were sufficient to identify the correct answer. They built an entire national contest around the premise that a careful viewer could watch the episode and figure out who pulled the trigger. And then, when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had figured it out. Either the clues were not as clear as advertised, or the red herrings were more effective than anyone realized, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence in the way the show implied it would. Let us look at the specific evidence and ask whether it actually holds up. The sundial. Burns falls. His hands land on W and S, which read from the other direction give you M and S. The show tells us this indicates Maggie Simpson, but Burns himself, in his account of the shooting, stated that his hands landing on those letters was not intentional. He was not trying to communicate anything. He simply fell. The sundial clue, the centerpiece of the show's solution, was described by the victim as a coincidence. The most important piece of physical evidence pointing to Maggie is something that Burns himself said was not meaningful: the gun. Burns carried his gun in a holster. The show established, in the lead-up to the shooting, that the holster was empty before the attack. The gun was missing from Burns's person before anyone shot him. Whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who came across the gun by chance and picked it up, someone who had not planned to shoot anyone, who was not carrying their own weapon, who encountered the opportunity and acted on it. This description fits Maggie. It also fits several other characters who were not carrying weapons that night, which narrows the field but does not close it. Burns's last words before being shot were, by the show's own account, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He was not surprised. He was not afraid. The phrasing is the phrasing you use when someone you have met before appears unexpectedly, a mild acknowledgement of a familiar presence. Does Burns know Maggie Simpson? Has he ever had a meaningful interaction with her? The show does not establish a prior relationship between Burns and the baby. Burns barely knows Homer, and Homer works for him directly. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and respond with the casual recognition of, "Oh, it's you," strains the internal logic of a man whose memory for people he has actually met is famously unreliable. And then there is Homer. In a later season, season 18, Homer states, apparently casually, that he was the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says this on camera. Nobody reacts, nobody reopens the case, nobody investigates the confession of an attempted murder. Homer simply says it, the scene continues, and the show moves on as though he said nothing of consequence. Either Homer is lying. This is plausible. Homer says many things that are not true, for attention or amusement or because his grip on reality is not always secure. Or, the original verdict was wrong. And Homer knows it because he is the one who actually fired the gun. If Homer shot Burns, then Maggie did not. And if Maggie did not, then a baby was blamed for a crime committed by her father. The DNA evidence was either contaminated or misread. Burns's testimony came from a man who had just emerged from a coma with a bullet wound in his body and might reasonably have been confused about the specific details of the experience. The sundial, which Burns himself called a coincidence, was treated as a meaningful clue. And Maggie, 1 year old, was identified as the perpetrator of an attempted murder and then simply not charged, because infants cannot be prosecuted. Which is, when you think about it, the perfect outcome for whoever the real shooter was. Blame the baby. The baby cannot deny it. The baby cannot testify to the contrary. The baby will never understand what she was accused of, never be punished for it, and never be in a position to clear her name because she does not yet have the language to try. Maggie was the perfect scapegoat. Not because she was guilty, but because her innocence was unprovable in both directions. The Marge theory is worth examining here, because it is one of the more carefully constructed alternate readings of the evidence. A Reddit user who built a detailed case for Marge as the real shooter pointed to several elements that the official narrative does not adequately explain. Marge had watched Burns destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, and steal the sunlight from her town. She is not someone who acts on impulse. Marge is the most controlled, most patient, most carefully composed member of the Simpson family, but she has a line. She always has a line. And Burns had crossed every version of it. The theorist argues that this is why Burns would not have identified Marge as the shooter when he woke up. Burns had, in an earlier episode, developed an infatuation with Marge. He fell for her, in the way that Burns occasionally allows himself to feel something for the world outside his office. He took a bullet intended to kill him, woke up in a hospital bed, and found himself in a position to either name the woman he had been drawn to or redirect the investigation towards someone else. He chose someone else. He let his eyes drift to the sundial. The letters M and S were there. Maggie Simpson was there. A baby cannot be convicted. He protected Marge, and the investigation, steered by his testimony, went exactly where he directed it. The alternate ending is the final piece of evidence that the official answer was not as settled as it appeared. A complete alternate conclusion was produced, animated, voiced, finished, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. This ending was aired during the show's 138th episode Spectacular, a clip show format where Troy McClure introduced it and then dismissed it by noting that accepting Smithers as the shooter would require ignoring all the DNA evidence, which would be downright nutty. That line is, "The show is telling you plainly," a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, a case in which DNA evidence was famously ignored by a jury in arriving at an acquittal. The show is winking. It is acknowledging that ignoring evidence in pursuit of a preferred conclusion is something that happens, that the official story is not always the true story, that the person who controls the investigation controls the outcome. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it before ultimately abandoning it. The point is that the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were arranged around whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was built backward, the shooter selected first, the evidence adjusted to fit after, which means the evidence was always circumstantial. The sundial, which Burns said was an accident. The DNA eyelash, which established only that a Simpson was present, not which Simpson fired the weapon. The testimony of a coma patient identifying a baby in a parking lot. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was closed. It was not solved. Burns was shot. The investigation found a result that satisfied the institutional need for resolution. The real answer, whether it is Homer, or Marge, or someone else entirely, is still out there somewhere in Springfield's memory, carried by whatever few residents paid close enough attention to the details and smart enough to know what those details meant. In Springfield, that is an extremely small group. Number, Section 4. How is Mr. Burns still alive? This is not a rhetorical question. This is not a joke. This is a genuine inquiry into what the show's own canon tells us about the biology, the medicine, and possibly the metaphysics of one Charles Montgomery Burns, the owner and operator of the Springfield nuclear power plant. Because within the established internal logic of The Simpsons, Burns is a medical impossibility. And the show has been building the evidence for this conclusion for decades without ever drawing attention to how strange the picture actually is. Begin with his age. The show has never committed to a single definitive birth year for Burns, but the timeline that emerges from his various references and flashbacks and historical anecdotes places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has described personal memories of events that occurred before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories about the early 1910s as though he was there not as family stories passed down to him, but as first-hand experience. He attended Yale. He served in the Second World War, though his role during that service was morally questionable at best. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during that war and concealed it for decades afterward. By the most conservative reading of his timeline, Burns is well over 100 years old. By a more liberal reading of the show's continuity, he might be approaching 140, and he is not merely surviving at this age, he is functioning at a high level in ways that the simple fact of his survival does not begin to explain. Burns runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal and state politics with a sophistication that requires long-term planning, an understanding of how systems work, and the patience to execute strategies that may take years to bear fruit. He schemes. He remembers. He holds grudges across decades. He anticipates moves and countermoves in negotiations and legal disputes with a strategic acuity that nobody else in Springfield can match. His body is frail. This is not in dispute. Burns moves through the world in a state of physical diminishment that is the most visible evidence of his extreme age. He has almost no muscle mass. He cannot open a child-proof cap. Bart Simpson once accidentally crushed him simply by catching him in an overly enthusiastic hug. The physical body of Charles Montgomery Burns is operating somewhere between antique and ruin, but his mind is razor-sharp. This is the contradiction that the show maintains throughout its run. A man who looks like he might not survive a brisk walk is simultaneously the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield. The gap between what his body can do and what his mind can do is not just unusual. It is not compatible with any natural process of aging we understand. The show addresses the mechanics of his survival directly in the Springfield files. As we touched on in the first section, Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so extreme that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow afterward. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, if he were to miss a scheduled session, he begins to deteriorate. His systems begin to fail. The margin for error is effectively zero. Burns's life is maintained the way you maintain a piece of industrial equipment through scheduled servicing, calibration, and replacement of whatever components have failed since the last maintenance window. Miss the service window, and the machine breaks down. The treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who built a nuclear power plant in a residential area, whose facility has been contaminating Springfield's water supply for decades, who employed a cadre of private physicians and researchers, who has a pharmaceutical division capable of synthesizing experimental compounds. His personal life extension treatment is rooted in the same nuclear material that his plant leaks into the river downstream. Burns is not just profiting from radiation, he is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material that its natural biological processes have been replaced. He cannot sustain himself through the cellular processes that keep ordinary humans alive. He requires external radiation input on a weekly schedule, the way a normal human requires food and water and sleep. The immune system revelation adds another layer of impossible biology to the picture. There is a famous scene, one of the show's most quoted moments, in which a doctor informs Burns that he has every disease known to medical science. Every single one, simultaneously, all present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains that this should, by any reasonable medical understanding, be killing him immediately and continuously. But it is not. Because of a phenomenon the doctor calls Three Stooges syndrome. Every disease Burns carries is trying to progress, trying to gain dominance, trying to take his life, but because every disease is doing this simultaneously, they create a state of perfect biological gridlock. Each one blocks the others. None can advance because all of them are competing for the same limited pathways. It is, the doctor explains, as though 3 people were trying to walk through a doorway at the same moment. None of them can get through. Burns is the sickest man in America. He is also, as a result, functionally indestructible. The show plays this as a comedy beat. It is one of the most quotable scenes the show has ever produced. But if you sit with it under the radiation theory framework, it stops being funny and becomes something considerably stranger. Burns's body is not maintaining this equilibrium naturally. No natural biological process creates a state of perfect disease balance in which hundreds of conditions cancel each other out with zero net mortality effect. The weekly radiation treatments are doing this. They are not curing his diseases. There is no cure for having every disease simultaneously. They are managing them, holding each one in stasis, calibrating the balance so that none of them tips the scales toward a fatal progression. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. Too much adjustment in one direction and one disease surges. Too little and another takes hold. The weekly session is how Smithers and Burns's medical team keep all the competing systems in balance. And this makes Smithers not just a loyal assistant or a devoted employee or a man whose feelings for his employer are more complicated than the professional relationship would suggest. Smithers is, functionally, Burns's life support system. Smithers manages the schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes his weekly appointments. Smithers monitors Burns's physical state with an obsessive attentiveness that the show sometimes plays for comedy, but that reveals itself, under scrutiny, as something much more serious. If Smithers leaves, if he is fired, if he resigns, if he is incapacitated, Burns will miss a treatment. The disease equilibrium will collapse. Every illness in his body will simultaneously surge forward, and Burns will die. Smithers knows this. He has always known this. The show establishes repeatedly that when Smithers is separated from Burns for extended periods, Burns becomes helpless in ways that go beyond the merely physical. His schedule falls apart. His routines collapse. His body begins to deteriorate. Smithers's devotion is not purely emotional, it is medical. He is the only person in Springfield who fully understands how Burns's biological maintenance protocol operates, and his absence is a death sentence for his employer. That knowledge sits underneath every interaction they have. It explains the intensity of Smithers's loyalty in ways that sentiment alone cannot account for. Burns's connection to historical events extends the picture further. The show has depicted Burns as having personal, first-hand knowledge of an extraordinary range of events across more than a century. He knew Howard Hughes. He has referenced the Gilded Age as personal memory. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution, and the Burns family dynasty is depicted as one of the oldest continuously operating power structures in American history, the kind of wealth that does not merely participate in the shaping of nations, but actively drives it. Burns inherited this legacy. He has been extending it for well over 100 years, and he has been doing so with a consistency of purpose and strategy that suggests he is not experiencing time the way that mortal people do. Where ordinary humans have a lifespan that allows for perhaps 4 or 5 decades of active, high-functioning adult life before the inevitable decline, Burns has been an active, high-functioning operation for well over a century. The question the show has never answered directly is whether Burns is unique in this, or whether his family has always found ways to extend their biological parameters. If the current Burns has been alive for 130 or 40 years through artificial means, is it possible that previous holders of the Burns family fortune employed comparable strategies using the best available technology of their respective eras? Before nuclear radiation, before the pharmaceutical infrastructure that currently keeps him alive, did the Burns family use other methods to sustain their grip on power across generations that should have seen them replaced by natural succession? The show does not say. What it does establish is that the Burns family has maintained continuous control of their fortune and their influence for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not emerge from normal generational transfer. Fortunes get divided, heirs make bad decisions, empires fall. The normal course of generational succession over centuries tends toward dispersion, not concentration. Something has been keeping the Burns dynasty continuous. Something has been ensuring that the power does not fragment, that the money does not dissipate, that the institutional memory does not get lost in the transition from one generation to the next. Burns's relationship with death is the final thread in this picture, and it is the one that brings everything back around to the Springfield everyone else lives in. Burns has come closer to actual death than almost any other character on the show. He has been shot by a baby. He has been hospitalized so many times that his medical record must constitute a separate wing of Springfield General. He has collapsed, been attacked, been poisoned, been abandoned in the wilderness in conditions that should have been fatal. He has been in situations where the show itself seemed to be setting up his permanent departure. And he keeps coming back, not through cartoon resilience, the way Homer absorbs physical trauma and walks away. Homer's survival is passive. The show simply does not let him die because it needs him. Burns's survival is engineered. Each time he comes back, it is because the machinery he has built over a century, the money, the physicians, the medical infrastructure, the pharmaceutical resources, the political influence that ensures no investigation ever gets too close, reassembles him. Homer's immortality is the product of narrative convenience. Burns's immortality is the product of relentless institutional effort sustained over a century. The scariest dimension of this picture is not Burns himself. It is what his survival means for Springfield. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on his treatments. His treatments depend on the infrastructure that only Burns's wealth can maintain. It is a closed loop. The man, the machine, and the money feeding each other in a cycle that has been running for over 100 years. Springfield cannot kill Burns. Not because Burns is literally immortal in some supernatural sense, because killing Burns would collapse the system that the town depends on. The plant would go dark. The economy would fail. The contamination would become unmanageable without the resources Burns provides to, in his way, contain it. Springfield is not just being poisoned by Burns, it is being sustained by him simultaneously. Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He may be the oldest man in America. He is kept alive by weekly radiation treatments, protected by an employee whose devotion is indistinguishable from a clinical medical necessity, surrounded by a population too impaired to question why the man who signs their paychecks glows in the dark and remembers the Spanish-American War as a personal experience. He is not immortal in any mystical sense. He is something more pragmatic and more disturbing. He is too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying the bill. Number, Section 5. The episode that broke Springfield's reality. There is an episode of The Simpsons that a significant portion of the fan base considers the single worst creative decision in the show's history. An episode so controversial that it has its own entry in the cultural memory of Simpsons fandom, cited reliably in any conversation about when the show went wrong or what the show lost when it stopped caring about the things that originally made it matter. The episode is from Season 9. It aired on the 28th of September, 1997. It is called The Principal and the Pauper, and the backlash it generated was not just immediate and fierce, it has been sustained for nearly 30 years. But here is the thing, the people who hate this episode have been reading it backward. The episode is not the moment The Simpsons stopped caring about continuity or internal consistency or the integrity of its own characters. It is the moment The Simpsons showed you, with complete transparency, the mechanism that makes all of those things possible. The machinery hidden behind every reset, every forgotten catastrophe, every impossible return to baseline that the show has been performing since its first season. The Principal and the Pauper is the episode that explains Springfield. Here is the setup. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner for 20 years of service to the school and community. It is a warm occasion, a celebration of an institution, a recognition of a man who has devoted 2 decades to the children of Springfield. And then, a stranger walks in. The stranger introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a real name, a real person, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, held for years, and then, when he finally escaped and made his way home, discovered that someone else was living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street punk from a rough background, no family worth speaking of, no future, nothing particular to recommend him. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a home or an identity worth keeping, decided not to correct her. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the relationships, the mother, and the position, and he lived inside that stolen life for 20 years until the real Skinner came through the door and the entire structure collapsed. Now here is where it gets strange. Here is where the episode does the thing that fans have been criticizing for 3 decades without recognizing what they were actually seeing. Springfield holds a town meeting. The real Seymour Skinner is present. Armin Tamzarian is present. The truth is fully established and fully public. Everyone in the room knows that their principal is a fraud, that the man who has been running their school and participating in their community and maintaining a relationship with Agnes for 2 decades is not who he claimed to be. And the town deliberates, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian for identity fraud, not on how to make things right for the actual Seymour Skinner, the man whose life was stolen, but on something more fundamental, whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. Springfield votes to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree, an actual legal document declaring that the imposter is the real Skinner, that the real Skinner's identity does not belong to him, and that it is now illegal, punishable by torture, to ever mention the actual truth of the situation again. The real Seymour Skinner, the genuine article, the war hero who survived captivity and came home to find his name and his mother and his entire life appropriated by someone else, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. The community expels the truth. They exile the man who represents it. and they make it a criminal act to speak his name. Fans called this a betrayal of the character of Seymour Skinner. They said it destroyed everything that made him interesting by revealing that everything about him was a fiction. They said the writers had broken the show's relationship with its own history. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among several other characters, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. The episode is consistently ranked among the worst in the show's entire run. But here is what none of those critiques acknowledge. The episode is not making a creative mistake. It is making a truthful observation. Springfield has always operated this way. The episode did not introduce a new behavior into the town's social contract. It made the existing behavior visible. It put the mechanism on screen, slowed it down, and showed the audience every step of the process by which Springfield decides what it will remember and what it will not. How many times has Springfield experienced something that should permanently alter its reality? The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been invaded. It has been sealed under a federal government dome. It has narrowly escaped nuclear meltdowns. It has encountered alien entities. It has had its sun blocked by a mechanical device built by its wealthiest citizen. And every single time, by the next episode, everything is back to the way it was before. Fans call this episodic storytelling. Production necessities, the floating timeline, the principal and the pauper calls it what it actually is, a collective social decision. A vote that Springfield takes, implicitly, every time something happens that it cannot afford to integrate into its narrative about itself. The vote is always unanimous. The mechanism is always the same. The inconvenient truth gets exiled. The comfortable fiction gets endorsed by institutional decree, and anyone who insists on remembering the truth gets treated as the problem. The coma theory reads this episode as Homer's unconscious mind creating a scenario that validates its own dream logic. If Homer is dreaming, if the entire post, 1993 Simpsons, is a coma patient's constructed reality, then Homer's dreaming brain needs to believe that lies can persist, that stolen identities can become real through collective agreement, that the dream version of a life can replace the real one and nobody will ever successfully challenge it. The town of Springfield voting to sustain Tamsarian's fiction is Homer's dreaming brain validating its own existence. His subconscious telling itself that the simulation it is running is legitimate, that the family it is dreaming about is real enough, that the agreement to treat the fiction as fact is binding. As long as Springfield votes to maintain the fiction, Homer never has to wake up. The radiation theory reads the episode as evidence that the town's cognitive impairment has progressed to a point where collective denial is not just socially convenient but neurologically necessary. If decades of radiation exposure have compromised the population's critical thinking and memory function, then their inability to sustain an uncomfortable truth is not a moral failure, it is a symptom. The vote is not cynical, it is the genuine, impaired response of a population whose brains have been conditioned away from confronting things that challenge their baseline sense of reality. Springfield forgets because remembering is too dangerous. Not emotionally dangerous, biologically dangerous. Their brains have been wired to reject information that disrupts the established pattern. And the established pattern says that things are fine, that the plant is safe, that the principal is who he has always said he was, that the fish having 3 eyes is simply a local quirk. The institutional denial theory, the reading that emerges from the principal and the pauper itself, suggests that Springfield's resets are deliberate, that the town maintains its impossible baseline state through conscious, collective acts of enforced forgetting, that every time a truth surfaces that threatens the agreed-upon version of reality, the community identifies it, isolates it, and eliminates it through whatever mechanism is available. Sometimes the mechanism is simply not talking about it. Sometimes it requires a legal decree. Sometimes it requires exiling the person who represents the truth. But the outcome is always the same. The comfortable fiction is preserved. The inconvenient reality is erased. And Springfield goes back to looking exactly like it is supposed to look. A normal town where normal people live, normal lives next to a nuclear plant that has 342 safety violations and has never been brought up to code. The real Seymour Skinner is the most important minor character in the show's history, not because of anything he does or says, but because of what happens to him. He is a man who came home from war with a legitimate claim to his own identity, a stronger claim than anyone in Springfield has to anything they possess. And he was tried by a kangaroo court of his neighbors and expelled from the community not for a crime but for being real. He is the canary in the coal mine. The man who showed up with proof that the official story was wrong and who was removed from Springfield before the proof could do any damage? That is not a comedy beat. The show is not making a joke here. The show is showing you the infrastructure of Springfield's denial, the physical mechanism that makes every reset possible, the social technology that allows a town of people with 4 fingers and yellow skin and a 3-eyed fish in the local river to look at each other every day and say, "Everything is normal here. Everything is fine." The real Skinner is out there somewhere, tied to a train, exiled from his own name, the last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. Number. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the most dangerous person in Springfield. Let us talk about Maggie. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She has never learned to walk without falling, never developed language beyond a few sounds, never done anything that a casual observer would identify as remarkable. She sits in her high chair. She sucks on her pacifier. She watches the world with enormous, unblinking eyes that register everything and reveal almost nothing. She is, by every superficial measurement, the least consequential member of the Simpson family. The baby in the background, the one who does not have storylines, does not drive plots, does not shape the episodes around her. She is there the way furniture is there, expected, present, unremarkable. She shot Mr. Burns. She led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker, outmaneuvering the staff and the facility's security systems while operating under the motor constraints of a 1-year-old. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations through what can only be described as calm, deliberate, strategically competent action. She was tested for intelligence, and the results came back either unexpectedly high or literally off the available scale, depending on which episode you are referencing. And through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, every display of ability that should prompt someone to stop and say, "Wait, what exactly is going on with that baby?" She has maintained her silence. She has kept her face neutral. She has looked back at the world with those enormous eyes and given nothing away. Begin with the shooting, because even if you accept the official explanation that Maggie shot Burns accidentally, the aftermath tells you something the official explanation cannot account for. After Burns identifies Maggie as the shooter and the investigation concludes, the episode has one final scene. The family has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully, deliberately, with a precision of attention that does not belong to a baby. She is checking her surroundings. She is confirming that nobody is watching. And then, once she has satisfied herself that she is unobserved, she moves her pacifier in a motion that directly mimics pulling a trigger. That sequence of actions requires situational awareness, the understanding that actions have different social consequences depending on who is present to observe them. It requires memory, the retention and access of an experience that occurred some time ago. It requires caution, the behavioral recognition that certain actions should be performed in private. And it requires impulse control, the ability to defer a behavior until the conditions are appropriate for it. These are not infant behaviors. These are the behaviors of someone who understands the social and legal implications of their actions and has determined that discretion is the optimal strategy. A baby does not check to make sure she is alone before reenacting a shooting. A baby does not understand why checking matters. Maggie understands. The Longest Daycare, the theatrical short film released in 2012, is the single clearest demonstration of what is actually happening behind Maggie's face. The premise is simple enough. Maggie is dropped at a daycare facility. She encounters a caterpillar about to become a butterfly. Another baby threatens the caterpillar, and Maggie sets out to protect it and release it. But the execution is a sustained, 7-minute portrait of cognitive operation at a level that should not be possible in a 1-year-old. Maggie does not just react in this short. She plans. She reads the environment systematically, identifying threats and obstacles and potential resources. She develops strategies that account for the behavior of other agents, the bully baby, the daycare staff, and she adjusts those strategies in real time when conditions change. She executes multi-step plans that require timing, spatial reasoning, and the ability to predict how other agents will behave in response to her actions. Her body works against her constantly. She falls, she stumbles, she cannot run when running would help. She is physically limited to the motor control of a 1-year-old, and that limitation costs her at several moments in the sequence. But her decision-making is flawless. Every choice she makes in the short film is the correct choice. Every move is optimized for the goal she has set. She compensates for every physical limitation through superior strategic thinking, and she succeeds not because she gets lucky but because she is operating at a cognitive level that her physical form simply cannot keep up with. She is, in the most literal sense, too smart for her own body. Now look at what the intelligence test episodes establish. Across several episodes, Maggie is subjected to various forms of cognitive assessment, and the results are consistently extraordinary. The show tends to play this as a quick visual gag. The testing equipment overloads, the examiner looks at the results with disbelief, the camera moves on before the number can be read, but the pattern is unmistakable. Maggie's intelligence registers as unusual in every context where it is measured. The family notices briefly and then forgets, because the Simpson family's baseline capacity for sustained attention to Maggie is not high. This brings us to the silence. Maggie has been surrounded by an exceptionally verbal family for 36 years. Homer never stops talking. Marge never stops worrying out loud. Bart is constitutionally incapable of passing through a room without commentary. Lisa narrates, analyzes, lectures, and debates with a frequency that would exhaust most people. The Simpson household is a wall of constant, overlapping, continuous noise. And in the middle of it, Maggie sits in silence, watching, processing, saying nothing. The theory that her silence is not a developmental lag but a strategic decision is the one that makes the most sense of everything the show has shown us about her. A mind operating at Maggie's apparent level would not fail to develop language in the normal timeline. A mind like hers would learn language faster than average, not slower. The developmental delay is not a cognitive limitation. It is a chosen posture. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is a genius. Her intelligence is not in question. It is the defining feature of her character and has been since the show's earliest episodes. She is brilliant, principled, analytically gifted, and passionately engaged with the world around her. And her intelligence has cost her everything. Isolation from her peers who cannot relate to her. Dismissal from her father who cannot sustain attention to her concerns. Mockery from a community that rewards loud stupidity and punishes quiet insight. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges the status quo and gets punished. Lisa carries her intelligence visibly, announces it, offers it to a world that does not want it, and the world responds by ensuring she understands how little it matters. Maggie has been watching this happen since the day she was born. She watched her sister, the smartest person in the family, objectively fight every single day for recognition, and receive in return only resistance, dismissal, and the particular loneliness of being right in a community that has collectively decided that being right is not the point. And Maggie reached a conclusion. Not the conclusion Lisa reached, which is to keep fighting regardless of the cost, because the fighting itself is meaningful. Maggie reached the opposite conclusion. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less you are noticed, the more you can accomplish. The moment you announce yourself, you become a target. Consider every remarkable thing Maggie has done. The shooting, the daycare rebellion, the various family-saving interventions scattered throughout the series. What happens after each of them? The family briefly acknowledges that something remarkable occurred and then goes back to treating Maggie as the baby. The community either misattributes the action or fails to see it at all. Chief Wiggum processes the shooting investigation in terms of who among the adult suspects is most plausible and arrives at Maggie only when all other options are exhausted. Nobody suspects the baby. Nobody monitors the infant closely enough to catch her organizing. Every heroic act Maggie performs happens in the margins, in the background, in the space where nobody has thought to look because babies do not do things worth looking for. Maggie has engineered this. She has maintained the most effective possible disguise, the disguise of being exactly what everyone expects her to be. Passive, helpless, wordless, a baby in a high chair with a pacifier and no apparent interiority. She has performed this role without a single break for 36 years, and she has performed it so well that not a single person in her family, not even Lisa, has put the pieces together. The radiation theory frames Maggie's intelligence as the extreme positive mutation, the other end of the spectrum from Homer's cognitive diminishment. If the plant's contamination affects different people differently, then Homer represents what happens when radiation takes something away. His brain, already not operating at peak capacity, is further impaired by the environmental contamination until he is left with something between 40 and 55% of typical cognitive function. Maggie is what happens when radiation gives something extraordinary. The same environmental cause, the same family, the same water and the same air and the same contaminated soil. But where the father's brain was diminished, the daughter's was amplified, accelerated past the normal developmental ceiling into territory that standardized testing cannot adequately measure. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive coin. The coma theory gives Maggie's brilliance a different, more tender explanation. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since 1993 is the product of an unconscious mind trying to hold on to its family, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is not a mutation. It is a prayer. Homer cannot see Maggie grow up. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot hear her speak or watch her take her first confident steps or learn what kind of person she eventually becomes. He lies in his hospital bed and dreams about a baby, and in the dream he gives that baby everything he fears she might need in a world where he is not there to protect her. He makes her indestructible. He makes her smarter than anyone around her. He makes her capable of things no baby could actually do, because in his coma, Homer needs to believe that Maggie will be okay. That she will be more than okay. That whatever happens, wherever the world takes her, she will have the tools to navigate it. Her genius is a father's prayer. But in the waking version of Springfield, if there is a waking version, the reading is darker and stranger. Maggie does not speak because she has learned that speaking gets you nothing in this town. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is punished in Springfield. She watches everything, remembers everything, understands everything. And she waits. For what? The show has never told us. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. She is the only character whose future remains genuinely unknown, whose capabilities have never been fully deployed, whose silence has never been broken in any permanent or definitive way. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk without falling and cannot speak beyond a few sounds and has, in that time, shot a billionaire, commanded a room full of babies, and quietly accumulated a level of understanding of Springfield and everyone in it that no other character can match. The most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace has not yet decided what to do with her power. And when she does, when Maggie finally breaks her silence and shows Springfield what has been sitting behind that blank baby stare for 3.5 decades, nobody will see it coming. Because that is exactly how she designed it. Number. Section 7. The predictions phenomenon. The Simpsons has been making the news for predicting the future with enough regularity that the phenomenon has become its own cultural story, separate from the show itself. People who have not watched The Simpsons in years, people who only know the show as a vague yellow presence from their childhood television, share clips of apparent predictions with the same mix of amazement and unease. How are they doing this? What do they know? Let us go through the predictions carefully, starting with the most famous and working toward the ones that are genuinely difficult to explain through conventional means. The Trump prediction. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future aired. It depicted a flash-forward scenario in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office, the president whose administration she is inheriting, is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump's election in 2016. The internet's response when Trump won was immediate and comprehensive. Screenshots circulated. The clip was shared millions of times. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted this" entered mainstream vocabulary as a shorthand for the show's apparently prophetic capacity. People who could not name a single episode from the show's 36th season could tell you that The Simpsons had predicted Trump. The show itself became newsworthy again on the basis of a 16-year-old joke. Then there is Siegfried and Roy. An episode from the mid-1990s depicted a thinly veiled version of the famous Las Vegas Magic and Big Cats act, with a white tiger attacking one of the performers on stage. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically mauled by one of the act's white tigers during a live performance. The similarity between the fictional depiction and the real event was striking enough to attract significant attention. The smartwatch. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a wrist-mounted device with the functionality of a modern smartwatch, a portable communication and computing device worn on the wrist years before such technology existed in any commercially available form. The Higgs boson. In a 1998 episode, Homer scrawls an equation on a blackboard that, when a physicist examined it decades later, appeared to predict the approximate mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson was experimentally confirmed in 2012. A mathematician reviewing the scribblings noted that Homer's equation, while not a formal derivation, pointed in the right direction. The flu from Asia. In a 1993 episode called Marge in Chains, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, and a frantic community-wide search for solutions. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. During the chaos of the fictional outbreak, the town inadvertently releases a swarm of killer bees which felt eerily relevant when Asian giant hornets, branded by media as murder hornets, were discovered in the Pacific Northwest during the actual 2020 pandemic. Disney buying Fox. In a 1998 episode, the show depicted a scenario in which Disney had acquired 20th Century Fox. This actually happened in 2019. The Simpsons, being a Fox property, was itself one of the properties that changed hands in the acquisition, meaning the show that predicted Disney buying Fox was then itself bought by Disney. Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra. A 1996 episode featured a comedy scenario involving Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill actually performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality. The list is long, longer than most people realize. Because the phenomenon is self-reinforcing, each new confirmed prediction generates more people actively looking for the next one, which increases the likelihood of finding apparent matches. The official explanation from inside the show is straightforward. Al Jean, the longtime executive producer, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly and bluntly. His position is essentially that with nearly 800 episodes of television produced over 36 years, with each episode containing dozens of jokes and satirical observations, some of that output is going to align with future events through sheer statistical probability. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during some of its peak seasons, made the point even more plainly. Most of what gets called a prediction is coincidence, filtered through the cyclical nature of history, and made visible by the internet's tendency to remember the hits and forget the misses. This explanation is correct. It is also incomplete. Fact-checking organizations have examined many of the most popular prediction claims and found that a substantial portion of them rest on selective memory and confirmation bias. The audience remembers the times The Simpsons was right and forgets the times it was wrong. The show has made predictions that did not come true. Predictions about jetpacks and moon colonies and political outcomes and technological developments that never materialized. Nobody shares those. Nobody builds cultural narratives around them. The internet is a confirmation bias machine, and The Simpsons has been running long enough to generate enough raw material that the confirmation bias engine can do extraordinary work with it. The writers are also not pulling guesses from thin air. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most academically credentialed in American television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, and comparable institutions. Several have backgrounds not just in English or comedy writing, but in mathematics, physics, computer science, and political theory. These are not people guessing randomly about the future. They are careful observers of the present, extrapolating current trajectories to their logical conclusions. The Trump prediction did not require prophetic capacity. It required only the observation that Trump had been publicly and seriously flirting with a presidential run since the late 1980s, that celebrity politics was a growing trend, and that if the trajectory continued, the logical absurd endpoint was a celebrity president. The show did not predict Trump's presidency. It identified a trend that was already visible and pushed it forward a few steps. The Disney-Fox prediction did not require time travel. It required only the observation that media consolidation was an accelerating force in the entertainment industry, and that the logical direction of that consolidation was fewer, larger entities consuming smaller ones. The flu outbreak did not require prophetic insight. Epidemiologists and public health professionals had been warning about pandemic risk from novel viruses originating in dense population centers, including in Asia, for years before 1993. The Simpsons writers were not the only people who saw this possibility. The smartwatch was not a prediction. It was a reasonable extrapolation of the trajectory of personal technology miniaturization. So, the conventional explanation holds up for most of the predictions. Volume, statistical probability, expert extrapolation, confirmation bias. But it does not hold up for all of them. The Siegfried and Roy episode is specific in ways that extrapolation does not fully account for. Predicting that exotic animal performers face danger from their animals is not a difficult observation, it is almost definitional. But depicting a white tiger attacking a performer on stage, and then seeing that exact scenario play out with that specific act in 2003, is a level of specificity that feels different from trend extrapolation. The white tiger, the stage, the attack. The echo between the fictional depiction and the real event is precise in ways that feel coincidental and are coincidental, but that also create an impression that does not dissolve when you explain the mechanism behind it. This is where the meta-theory becomes genuinely interesting. The most compelling reading of the prediction phenomenon is not that The Simpsons predicts the future through any mechanism: prophetic writing staff, time travel, access to classified information, divine inspiration. The most compelling reading is that The Simpsons shapes the future through its cultural influence. The show is not predicting America, it is diagnosing America. It takes the trends and pathologies and directions of American life, identifies their logical endpoints, and presents those endpoints as comedy. And then those endpoints arrive not because the show predicted them, but because the show, by depicting them, made them part of the cultural vocabulary, made them familiar before they happened, made them feel, when they arrived, less like a shocking development than like an obvious punchline that everyone had been waiting for. The Simpsons made Trump's presidency feel like an inevitability years before it happened, not by predicting it, but by inserting the idea into the cultural bloodstream, making it a reference point, making it something people had already half imagined. When the reality arrived, it did not feel like a prediction being confirmed. It felt like a joke finally arriving at its punchline. Springfield is not a reflection of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was when the show started writing about it. The nuclear power plant and the incompetent safety inspector and the corrupt billionaire and the population too distracted and impaired to notice how badly they are being exploited, these were not prophecy. These were observation. The show just wrote it down before the rest of us stopped to look. And here is the final uncomfortable truth about the prediction phenomenon. The Simpsons has also made jokes that did not come true. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Jokes about futures that never arrived, about political outcomes that went the other way, about technologies that never materialized, about cultural directions that reversed. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody shares them on social media. When you produce nearly 800 episodes of television over 36 years, and you filter the entire output through the internet's confirmation bias machinery, the failures disappear and the successes stack up into something that looks like prophecy. It is not prophecy, it is statistics, made visible by selective attention. But knowing that does not make the hits any less striking. And knowing how the trick works does not fully dissolve the impression it creates. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about America, and enough of them accurate enough that the show's own creators have paused, occasionally, and wondered. Even when you understand the mechanism, the pattern is still there. Springfield is still us. Number Section 8, Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer Simpson's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, the old man in the retirement home, the World War II veteran, with the increasingly unreliable grip on the boundary between memory and story, had told Homer that his mother died when Homer was young. He had taken Homer to a grave. Homer had mourned, in the way that a child mourns when they are told they have lost something they never quite had a chance to understand they had. He grew up with that absence as a constant background condition of his life. The way a room missing furniture feels different without ever being empty. And that absence shaped everything about Homer Simpson. His clinginess with Marge, the desperate quality of his need for her approval that exists underneath the show's comedy, his terror of being left alone, his compulsive need to be liked by the people around him, which coexists with a remarkable tolerance for being disliked and dismissed that most people with healthy self-esteem would not be able to sustain. His willingness to absorb humiliation from Burns, the man who cannot remember his name after decades of employment, without reaching any kind of breaking point, because the alternative, the risk of losing the stable thing in his life, is worse than any indignity. Homer Simpson's personality is a coping mechanism for maternal loss. Everything strange and sad and endearing about him traces back to the same root, a boy who was told his mother died and who built his entire emotional architecture around that vacancy. In Season 7, the show revealed that the vacancy was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on the 19th of November, 1995, and it is considered by a large portion of the show's fan community to be one of the greatest single episodes the show has ever produced. What happens in it is this. Homer, through a chain of events that begins with him faking his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, ends up at the Hall of Records to correct the municipal records that now list him as deceased. And while he is there, he discovers something. According to Springfield's municipal records, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave that Abe showed him, the headstone that Homer has been mourning at for whatever version of his childhood, fits the floating timeline. It is not his mother's grave. It belongs to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been using a famous writer's headstone as a stand-in for his wife's burial site and presenting it to his son as the real thing. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery. She is visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She does not recognize the adult man in front of her the last time she saw Homer. He was a young child, and 30 years have passed. But when Homer proves who he is, they reunite in one of the most genuinely emotional scenes the show has ever produced. And then Mona tells Homer the truth. She left in 1969. She was a housewife, married to Abe, with a young son named Homer. The world was in a particular state of ferment that year, the civil rights movement, the counterculture, the protests against Vietnam, and something in that ferment reached Mona. She was radicalized. She became involved with a group of activists and eventually participated in an action against a biological weapons laboratory, a laboratory owned by Charles Montgomery Burns. Burns owned a facility in Springfield that was researching and developing weaponized biological agents. Not a nuclear plant, a germ warfare lab. He was manufacturing weaponized pathogens in the same town where Springfield families were living their ordinary lives, attending their schools, shopping at the Quick E-Mart, and doing all the things people do when they believe their community is safe. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device that would neutralize the biological agent stored in the facility. The raid worked. The germs were destroyed. But in the chaos of their escape, Mona made one mistake. She stopped to help someone who had fallen a person knocked down in the commotion of the raid. That person was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. And Burns, being Burns, responded to this mercy by looking at her face, memorizing her features, and reporting her to the FBI. From that moment, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not pick up the phone and call her son or write him a letter or find any way to tell him what had happened and why she could not be there. The FBI would track the contact. The FBI would find her. And if they found her, everything she had been hiding for becomes a legal catastrophe, with consequences extending to Abe and to Homer. She kissed Homer goodbye one night while he was sleeping. He never knew she was there. He woke up and his mother was gone. And his father told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades living inside that explanation, building his personality around the grief it produced. Burns pursued her. This is the piece of the story that transforms what might be a sad episode about a missing mother into something that implicates the entire structure of Homer's life. Burns did not simply report Mona to the FBI and move on. He held a grudge against her for decades, a personal, active, sustained grudge against a woman who had destroyed his weapons program. When Mona returned to Springfield in Season 7, walking back into her son's life for the first time since 1969, Burns recognized her almost immediately. He spotted her through a cab window and called the authorities. The FBI arrived at the Simpson house. Mona had to run again. Homer had to watch his mother disappear for the second time, and this time he knew why. He knew who was responsible, and he knew that the person responsible was his own employer. Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns his entire adult working life. Homer's paychecks have come from the man who destroyed his family, who forced his mother into permanent exile, who ensured that Homer grew up without her. And Homer, when he learns this, when the connection between his employer and the man who took his mother is laid out in front of him, does not quit, does not confront Burns, does not connect the dots in a way that produces any kind of action. Homer is too cognitively impaired to see the architecture of his own suffering. This is not played for comedy in the episode. It is played as tragedy. The show understands what it is showing you. Homer has a brain damaged by a crayon, further impaired by decades of radiation exposure, operating at a fraction of its potential capacity, and faced with a conspiracy of circumstance that would require sustained analytical thinking to untangle. He cannot do it. The tools he would need to see the pattern clearly are exactly the tools that have been taken from him. And this is where the conspiracy fully assembles. Burns did not just ruin Mona's life. Burns engineered Homer's. When Burns reported Mona to the FBI in 1969, he was not thinking about Homer. Homer was a child, an incidental consequence of action taken against a woman Burns wanted to punish. But the effect of removing Mona from Homer's life was to produce exactly the kind of person that Burns, as an employer, finds most useful. A man desperate for approval, a man terrified of abandonment, a man who will endure virtually anything: humiliation, unsafe working conditions, being unable to get his own boss to learn his name after decades, rather than risk losing the job that provides the stability his damaged emotional architecture requires. A man who, because he grew up believing he was the kind of son whose mother would rather die than stay, has a deep and persistent belief that his value to the people in his life is conditional and fragile and must be continuously earned by compliance. A man who will never organize, never unionize, never confront the power structure above him. A man who will do his job badly, every day, and be grateful for the opportunity. The ideal employee for a nuclear power plant that relies on its safety inspector looking the other way. The show later reveals a further layer to this structure. Burns, at some point in the past, had committed a crime, and Grandpa Simpson had discovered it. Rather than face the consequences of that discovery, Burns struck a deal with Abe. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would have a job at the plant for life, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how incompetent the reviews showed him to be, no matter how many times he should have been terminated. The number cited in the show for Homer's documented errors is 742. Homer has made 742 documented errors in his safety role at a nuclear power plant, and he has never been permanently let go. Because of a deal his father struck with the man who took his mother. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential. He took the person Homer might have been if his emotional development had not been shattered at age 6 by a disappearance he could not understand. He took the version of Homer that the removed crayon episode briefly reveals: the intelligent, articulate, perceptive Homer who, when given access to the full capacity of his own mind, immediately starts seeing Springfield for what it really is. Mona fought against Burns and lost everything. Abe made a deal with Burns and buried the truth. Homer inherited both the loss and the consequences of the deal and never understood the shape of what had been done to him. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken by one man's grudge and one town's inability to resist it. When Mona died in a later season, in a scene quiet enough that you could almost miss how much weight it carries, Homer sat beside her and held her hand and watched the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. The show did not cut away. It did not reach for a joke. It held the moment. A man and his mother, and 30 stolen years pressing down on both of them. Burns won. He always wins. In Springfield. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say that Homer Simpson works at the power plant until he dies, because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Number, Section 9. Where is Springfield? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people could describe its layout, its landmarks, its residents, and its general atmosphere than could name the capital city of half the actual states in the actual country. It is more real, in the collective imagination, than most real places. It is also completely unlocatable on any actual map, and the show has been making it unlocatable on purpose, with great deliberate care, for 36 years. Springfield has a nuclear power plant, it has a tire fire, it has a gorge, it has a harbor, it has a monorail, a prison, a retirement home, 2 hospitals, a bar, an elementary school, a church, a quick-service convenience store. It has mountains visible from town. It has ocean access. It has farmland and forests and what appears to be desert. It borders, depending on which episode you are watching, the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, 4 states that are nowhere near each other on any real American map. The town's climate shifts between Arctic blizzard and tropical heat wave within the span of a single season. Its geography contains features that cannot logically coexist within the area of a small American municipality. Ocean and mountains and desert and forest and farmland, all within apparent driving distance of the same main street. Springfield does not exist in any single state. It exists, simultaneously, in all of them. The show has spent 36 years building this impossibility with meticulous care. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow the possibilities, a state abbreviation, an area code, in a reference to a neighboring city, another clue appears in a different episode that directly contradicts the first one. The show creates the impression of geographic grounding and then dismantles it before it can solidify. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the location question directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said that he named the town Springfield because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, and because he grew up near Springfield, Oregon, and the name had a kind of comfortable familiarity to it. He confirmed in that interview that the original inspiration for the location was Springfield, Oregon. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was solved. Then the show continued airing episodes that placed Springfield in geographic contexts completely inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's confession. They kept the mystery alive, kept the contradictions coming, kept Springfield floating free of any fixed coordinate on the American map. Because the mystery is the point, Springfield's geographic unlocatability is not a production oversight or a continuity failure or a casual disregard for internal consistency. It is a design decision, made deliberately and maintained deliberately for the entirety of the show's run. The surface explanation is that Springfield is meant to be universal every American's hometown, regardless of which actual state they grew up in. By refusing to anchor Springfield in any specific geography, the show ensures that every viewer can recognize it. The Rust Belt factory town and the New England village, and the southern small city and the Midwestern bedroom community all find themselves reflected in Springfield because Springfield has been built from the emotional raw material of all of them simultaneously. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. This is true. Groening has confirmed it. The writers have confirmed it. It is the explicit design philosophy behind the show's treatment of its fictional geography. But the theories we have been discussing all night suggest that Springfield's geographic impossibility is not just a design choice. It is a feature of the town's reality, whatever that reality actually is. If the radiation theory is correct, if Springfield has been a contamination zone for decades, if the population's biology has been fundamentally altered by chronic nuclear exposure, why should the geography be exempt from the warping? The radiation has bent the rules of biology. Why not the rules of physics? Why not space itself? If the people of Springfield can have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive falls that should kill them, perhaps the geography of Springfield can have mountains and oceans and deserts, all within a short drive of the same main street, because the contamination that distorts biology also distorts the physical landscape. If the coma theory is correct, if Springfield is a dream being generated by Homer's unconscious mind, then the geographic impossibility is even more elegantly explained. Homer does not have a precise, cartographically accurate map of America stored in his memory. He has impressions. He has fragments. He has the mountains from a family vacation, and the ocean from a commercial he saw on television, and the farmland from a drive through the Midwest, and the desert from a movie, and the small-town feeling of wherever he actually grew up. His unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered or imagined, layering them without regard for geographic consistency because dreams have no need for geographic consistency. Dreams have emotional logic. Dreams have the logic of feeling rather than the logic of maps. And Springfield feels like America because it is made from Homer's memory of America, scattered, incomplete, held together by longing rather than geography. If the Tamsarian episode's theory about Springfield's collective denial applies here, if Springfield is a community that has organized itself around the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate expression of that capacity. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring federal charges against a nuclear power plant if the state it is located in keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything if the jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means having a fixed regulatory authority. Landing means a consistent EPA jurisdiction. Landing means a permanent state attorney general who might start asking about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who has been alive for 130 years. Geographic uncertainty is a legal shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory oversight. The contamination has no fixed legal address. Burns has no fixed court of jurisdiction to appear before. Springfield's impossibility is not a bug. It is a feature. And it is the feature that makes every other impossibility possible. The plant can keep running because there is no fixed authority with clear jurisdiction to shut it down. Burns can keep operating because there is no consistent legal framework with clear authority over him. The residents can keep accepting the situation because there is no external pressure from any fixed external institution to make them examine it. Springfield exists in the space between jurisdictions, in the gap between maps, in the territory that the actual regulatory and legal machinery of the United States has never quite learned how to reach. And there, in that gap, the cooling towers keep steaming. The fish have 3 eyes, the children have 4 fingers, the old man glows in the dark, and nobody asks why, because there is nobody outside the town with the authority and the jurisdiction and the institutional memory to come in and make them. Number. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. Why Nobody Ages. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when the show debuted on the 17th of December, 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1. She is still 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are. 36 years have passed in the real world. Entire human generations have been born, grown up, and started having children of their own in the time since the show first aired, and in Springfield, 0 years have passed. The characters exist in a state of permanent temporal suspension. Everything around them changes. Technology changes. Cultural references change. The show updates itself to match whichever year it is currently airing. The characters have smartphones now, reference contemporary events, respond to the world as it currently exists. But the characters themselves do not age. The children do not grow up. The adults do not accumulate years. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It is a standard approach for long-running animated series. The Flintstones never aged, the Jetsons never aged, and most audiences accept it as a basic condition of the format without examining it too closely. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so fundamental, so structurally embedded, that they have begun to crack the show's internal logic from the inside. The most obvious fault line runs through Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their shared history was grounded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met as teenagers, fell in love, had Bart. Their courtship was set in a specific era, with era-specific music and fashion and cultural reference points that made sense for characters who were in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. Homer's hair, Marge's prom dress, the disco and the post-Vietnam anxiety, and the particular texture of American life in that specific decade. As the floating timeline dragged the present forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they could not have met in 1980. They would have met around 2005. Their high school experience would not have been shaped by Watergate and the oil embargo. It would have been shaped by MySpace and the early internet, and the particular cultural texture of the mid-2000s. The show has acknowledged this explicitly. In multiple flashback episodes across different seasons, Homer and Marge's formative years have been rewritten to match the era that fits their current age. They were grunge fans in one version, hipsters in another, millennials in a later one. Their origin story has been told and retold at least 4 times, each version placing their youth in a different decade, each version internally consistent with the floating timeline, but inconsistent with all the previous versions. Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. They have an approximated past that gets revised whenever the current episode requires it. Now apply the theories. The coma theory addresses the aging problem most simply and most completely. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and has not woken up. The people in Homer's dream are frozen at the ages they were when he last saw them with conscious eyes. Of course, they do not age. His dreaming mind cannot imagine them aging because it was not there to see it happen. The radiation theory proposes that the town's contamination has altered the biology of its residents at a cellular level deep enough to interfere with normal aging processes. Something in the chemical soup that Springfield's residents have been swimming in for decades has changed the way their cells replicate and repair and deteriorate. The effect is not immortality in any clean sense. Burns, who has the resources to manage his radiation exposure carefully, still needs weekly medical intervention to sustain himself. But for ordinary residents, the effect might be a dramatic slowing of the aging process, a kind of involuntary suspended animation that manifests as the show's floating timeline. The principle and the pauper theory argues that Springfield has simply voted not to age. The community has decided, through the same collective mechanism by which it voted to pretend Tamzarian was Skinner, that time will not be acknowledged as passing, that the children will continue to be the ages they are, that the parents will continue to look the way they look, that the town will be what it was the day the social contract was last renewed. And anyone who challenges this, anyone who insists on tracking time, noting birthdays, pointing out that the children should be adults by now, will be treated as a disruption of the agreed-upon reality. The Burns immortality theory notes that if one person in Springfield has successfully negotiated the boundary between mortal and post-mortal existence, then the conceptual category of aging is already unstable in this universe. If Burns can live for a century and 30 years through technological and chemical intervention, then perhaps the residents of Springfield, exposed to those same general forces, have had their own relationship with time altered in ways they cannot articulate and the show cannot fully explain. All four theories arrive at the same observation through different paths. Time does not work in Springfield. Something has broken the normal flow of it. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is a symptom of whatever has gone wrong with this town. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done this multiple times, in flash-forward episodes that are some of the most emotionally resonant work the show has ever done. Lisa's Wedding, from Season 6, is a full episode set in a future where Lisa is a young adult woman engaged to be married. The future it depicts is specific and detailed and emotionally rich. Lisa has grown up into the person the show has always been building toward: brilliant, principled, searching for connection, slightly lonely, fiercely idealistic about a world that is not always idealistic back. The episode is extraordinary, and it proves that the show can imagine these characters as adults. It has the tools to tell that story. It knows what those futures would look like. It chooses not to tell them. At the end of the episode, Lisa is 8 again. The future closes. The present resumes. The flash-forward is a glimpse through a window that immediately shuts. The show can see the futures of its characters but refuses to arrive there. Why? The show's own answer, in the quieter moments when it speaks about itself, is that The Simpsons represents something that cannot be allowed to change. The Simpsons are not just a family in a show. They are the American family, the collective household of a nation that has spent 36 years returning to them every week for something that is not quite comfort and not quite familiarity, but is somewhere in between. They are the version of the middle-class family that America keeps. Not the ideal version, not the aspirational version. The real version: chaotic, loving, infuriating, resilient, perpetually recovering from the last disaster and heading toward the next one. The moment the Simpson children grow up is the moment the show becomes something else. Something elegiac. Something that acknowledges the passage of time rather than suspending it. Something that admits that the couch on which we all sat and watched these first episodes is now in a landfill or in a stranger's house, that the children who first watched Bart get on a skateboard in 1989 are now approaching middle age, that 36 years of real time have accumulated on the other side of the screen, even if Springfield has not aged a day. The floating timeline is not a production decision. It is an emotional agreement, a pact between the show and its audience. We will not let them grow up. We will not let them leave. We will press pause in 1989, and we will keep pressing it forever. Because the moment we let go of the pause, the moment we press play and let time start moving in Springfield, we have to acknowledge everything that has moved in the world while we were watching. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we froze them. Because the alternative, a Springfield where Bart is middle-aged and Lisa is approaching 40, and Maggie has finally decided to speak, is a Springfield we are not ready to see. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week and confirm that the walls are still standing and the family is still intact. And every time we watch, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for Springfield to escape into time. Because if they escape, if the timeline stops floating, then they have to grow up. And if they grow up, they leave. And if they leave, the show ends. The Simpsons are 10 and 8 and 1 and mid-30s forever, because forever is the only arrangement that lets everyone stay. Number Section 11 Hans Moleman's death cycle and the dark truth about Ned Flanders. Let us talk about Hans Moleman. If you have watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know who Hans Moleman is even if you do not know his name. He is the tiny elderly man nearly blind behind his thick glasses, moving through the world at a pace that suggests he is not entirely certain the world is moving with him, who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists, primarily, to experience misfortune. He gets hit by cars, he gets crushed under objects, he gets buried alive, he gets struck by lightning, he gets attacked by animals, he gets incinerated, he walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He drowns, he falls, he gets launched from catapults and struck by aircraft and consumed by the kind of industrial accidents that should prompt OSHA investigations. He is, by any reasonable estimate, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The remarkable thing is not how often Hans Moleman dies. The remarkable thing is how often he comes back. He does not come back through any acknowledged narrative mechanism. There is no resurrection episode. There is no explanation. There is no moment where the show addresses the fact that this man died 2 episodes ago and is now standing in the background of a different scene. He simply reappears, alive, ambulatory, ready to experience the next catastrophe. Most fans accept this as a running gag. Moleman dies a lot. It is a bit. Do not think about it. But if you think about it under the radiation theory, Moleman's death cycle becomes one of the strangest pieces of evidence for the theory's core premise. The radiation theory proposes that Springfield's contamination has altered the biology of the town's residents in ways that extend beyond the cosmetic. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the physiological resilience that lets Homer survive falls and electrocutions, these are the visible effects. But in Moleman, we might be seeing the extreme outer boundary of what the contamination can do. A biology so fundamentally altered by nuclear exposure that it has developed something approaching regenerative capacity. Where Homer's body absorbs trauma and heals faster than biology should allow, Moleman's body appears to have found a way to reconstitute itself after complete failure. He does not endure death. He recovers from it. The cellular damage is repaired at a rate that is not compatible with any natural biological process. If the coma theory applies to Moleman, he is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character whom Homer's unconscious mind does not track carefully enough to maintain consistently between dream cycles. Moleman dies because Homer's dreaming brain occasionally lets secondary characters lapse. He comes back because the dream needs bodies to populate Springfield, and Homer's brain reassembles him for the next scene without tracking what happened in the previous one. In this reading, Moleman is not a person with an independent existence inside the dream. He is scenery that occasionally becomes consequential and then gets reset. Moleman once stated his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him. He appears to be somewhere between 80 and 100. His physical appearance suggests a man who has lived far longer than 31 years, and whose body shows the accumulated damage of that time. If he is telling the truth about his age and there is no in-show reason to believe he is not, then something aged him catastrophically. Something took a man at the beginning of his productive adult life and compressed decades of physical deterioration into a period that should have been his prime. The same contamination that makes Moleman nearly indestructible may have accelerated his aging. The same forces that give him regenerative capacity may have burned through his biological timeline at an accelerated rate. He dies and comes back because his body has been altered past the point of normal mortality in one direction. He looks 90 at 31 because the radiation has done to his visible aging what it has done to everything else in Springfield. It has broken the normal rules and replaced them with something else entirely. Now let us talk about Ned Flanders. Ned is the character the show has quietly destroyed most thoroughly, and the darkness embedded in his storyline is one of the most unsettling subtexts in the entire series. On the surface, Ned Flanders is everything Homer is not. He is kind. He is generous. He is genuinely devout in his faith, and his faith is presented as sincere rather than performative. He is physically fit, financially responsible, a good father to his sons, and a neighbor of almost supernatural patience and goodwill. He is, by every objective measurement, a substantially better person than Homer in essentially every dimension. The show punishes him for this without ceasing. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife, was killed at a Springfield Speedway event when a t-shirt cannon misfired. The trajectory of the misfired t-shirts was a direct consequence of Homer dodging them. Homer's reflexive self-preservation caused the shirts to arc in a direction that struck Maude and knocked her from the bleachers. To her death. Homer's selfishness killed Ned's wife. And Ned forgave him. Not immediately, and not without difficulty. The episode in which it happens is one of the show's more quietly devastating pieces of work. But Ned forgave Homer. Because that is what Ned does. Because his faith tells him to turn the other cheek, and his personality, as established across years of episodes, is oriented entirely toward forgiveness and grace and the patient absorption of everything that the world throws at him. Then a hurricane destroys Ned's house. The community rallies to rebuild it in an episode that might initially seem like a warm demonstration of Springfield solidarity. And it would be, except that the community builds the house so badly, so quickly, so carelessly, using such fundamentally wrong construction techniques that it collapses immediately after completion. Ned looks at the ruin of his rebuilt house, and something in him breaks. He snaps. He stands in front of the assembled community and says the things that have been building inside him for years, maybe decades. He insults people by name. He catalogs the ways in which his neighbors have failed him. He speaks with a fury and a precision that is genuinely shocking, coming from a man whose baseline mode is cheerful acceptance of everything the universe dishes out. And then he is institutionalized. He is committed to a psychiatric facility for the breakdown. And in that facility, during his treatment, the show reveals something about Ned Flanders that reframes everything that came before. Ned was not born this way. His relentless niceness, his almost superhuman patience, his inability to sustain anger or resentment, these are not natural character traits. They are the product of behavioral modification conducted when Ned was a child. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, described as beatniks who did not believe in traditional discipline, were unable to manage his behavior. They took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral therapy. The niceness was installed. The patience was programmed. The endless capacity for forgiveness was not something Ned chose or cultivated. It is the result of a process conducted on him as a child, without his consent, that rewired the way his brain handles anger. Ned Flanders cannot get genuinely sustainably angry. His brain was modified to prevent it. The conditioning holds so thoroughly that what looks, from the outside, like saintly grace is actually a psychological cage. Everything about Ned reads differently once you know this. His patience with Homer is not the patience of a man who has genuinely worked through his feelings about a difficult neighbor and arrived at acceptance. It is the patience of a man whose brain physically will not allow him to sustain the anger that the situation fully warrants. Homer has caused Ned immeasurable harm over decades: property damage, personal humiliation, the death of his wife, and Ned continues to be Homer's neighbor and something approaching Homer's friend because he has no mechanism for the alternative. His faith is not the conviction of a man who has thought deeply about theology and arrived at genuine belief. It is a coping structure, a framework that Ned's damaged psyche requires to organize the experience of suffering without access to anger. If you cannot be angry at the things that happen to you, you need a story that makes those things meaningful. You need a reason that those things are happening. Faith provides that. God has a plan. There is a purpose. This is not punishment. It is preparation. It is an explanation that Ned needs to sustain himself. Because the actual explanation that random misfortune and inconsiderate neighbors have cost him disproportionately and that nobody will be held accountable is not something his conditioned mind can process without destroying whatever equilibrium it maintains. And then there is the theological dimension of the show's treatment of Ned. God talks to Homer. The show establishes this as canonical fact across multiple episodes. Homer has had actual, direct, face-to-face conversations with God, not symbolic dream sequences, not metaphorical experiences, literal conversations. God appears to Homer. God speaks to Homer. God has expressed opinions about Homer's life and has offered Homer specific information about his future. God has never, in 36 seasons of The Simpsons, spoken to Ned Flanders. Ned, who goes to church every Sunday. Ned, who prays regularly and sincerely. Ned, who has dedicated his life, his entire conscious, public, relational life to the practice of his faith. Ned, who has absorbed more loss and more unfairness than anyone in Springfield except possibly Mona Simpson, and who has absorbed it quietly and without complaint because his faith tells him to. God has never answered Ned. God answers Homer, who skips church, who does not pray, who treats religion as an occasional novelty when it is relevant to his immediate circumstances. God answers Homer. God does not answer Ned. The show is making a statement. It is making it as plainly as a comedy show about a yellow cartoon family can make a statement, but the statement is there. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Compliance is rewarded. The system, whether it is Burns's economic empire or the radiation or the collective denial or some combination of all of these forces, does not care about moral behavior. It cares about keeping people where they are. Homer is where he is because the system keeps him there. He is compliant because he is damaged, and because the damage makes him compliant, and because his compliance serves the interests of the structures above him. Ned is where he is because the system keeps him there too. He was programmed toward compliance before he was old enough to choose. His compliance serves a different function. He is the model of what happens when a person does everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. The cautionary example that Burns's arrangement could never produce directly because it requires a subject who genuinely tries rather than a subject who has given up. Ned and Homer live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, between the man who does everything right and the man who does almost everything wrong, between the man the system programmed for compliance through suffering and the man the system kept compliant through damage, has never closed. Because in Springfield, the gap doesn't close. The system is not designed to close it. The system is designed to keep everyone exactly where they are, in the roles that serve the larger structure, in the loop that has been running since the cooling towers first started leaking. That is Springfield. That is every mystery we have been sitting with tonight, reduced to its most fundamental form. Section 12. Everything comes back to one house. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have followed the radioactive trail from the cracked cooling towers down into the water table and back up through the yellow skin of every resident. We have sat with Homer in his hospital bed, his dreaming mind generating the show you have been watching since 1993, his unconscious brain refusing to let the story end, because ending the story means losing the family. We have reopened the Burns shooting case and looked at the clues again, and the clues still do not add up the way the show wants them to. We have tried to understand what keeps a man alive for 130 years, and found that the answer is not magic but money, the kind of wealth that builds infrastructure and then charges everyone else to use it. We have watched Springfield vote to exile the truth. We have looked behind Maggie's pacifier and found something extraordinary and patient and silent. We have counted the predictions that came true and thought carefully about the ones nobody counted. We have followed Mona Simpson from a suburban living room in 1969 all the way to a cemetery reunion with a son who grew up believing she was dead. We have searched for Springfield on a map and found it in every state and no state. We have stared at the floating timeline long enough to understand that it is not the show's cage, it is ours. And now here we are, at the end of the night, at the end of the journey. What do we actually know? We know that Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town where strange things happen for comedic effect. The show has spent 36 years building a case for something stranger and sadder than that. Springfield is a place where the normal rules do not apply, where time does not pass, and people do not age, and catastrophes are forgotten by the following week, and the impossible happens with the regularity of weather. And every theory we have explored tonight offers a different explanation for how that is possible, but every theory arrives at the same conclusion. Something is wrong here, something fundamental, something that goes all the way down. The radiation theory says the contamination is real, that the yellow skin and the four fingers and the impossible survival and the collective forgetting are all symptoms of the same cause, and that the cause is sitting on a hill overlooking the town, leaking its invisible poison through cracked walls and into the water table, feeding the brains that cannot figure out why it keeps doing it. The coma theory says none of it is real except in the mind of a man in a hospital bed, a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and has been dreaming about his family ever since, building them a Springfield that never changes because he cannot afford to imagine them changing, running the dream with the last remaining capacity of a brain that has been slowly, quietly losing the battle since a vending machine fell on him. The Tamsarian theory says it is all real, but the reality is collectively maintained that Springfield's impossible baseline state is the product of an ongoing, unspoken social agreement to forget whatever needs to be forgotten and remember whatever needs to be remembered, enforced by whatever mechanism the moment requires, from casual social pressure all the way to legal decree and physical expulsion. The Burns theory says one man's will and one man's money and one man's determination to sustain himself through whatever means are available has bent Springfield around him, the way a massive object bends space, not through intention but through the sheer gravitational force of concentrated power sustained over an impossible length of time. The prediction theory says Springfield and America have been in a feedback loop for 36 years, the show diagnosing what is wrong and America gradually becoming what the show described, until the distinction between the cartoon and the country has become genuinely difficult to locate. All of these theories are different. All of them use different evidence and different logic. None of them is provably correct. None of them needs to be. What they all share is a willingness to look at Springfield honestly, to take seriously what the show has been showing us, to treat the details as meaningful rather than dismissing them as cartoon conventions, to follow the threads and see where they lead. And where they lead, every one of them, is to a house on Evergreen Terrace. A house where a man with a slightly wrong skull and 4 fingers on each hand comes home every evening from a job at the most dangerous industrial facility in the history of fiction, ate something terrible for dinner, fell asleep on the couch, and woke up the next morning to do it all again. A house where a woman with blue hair that defies gravity has kept her family together through 36 years of catastrophe and disaster and economic uncertainty and the particular exhausting patience required to love Homer Simpson, fully and without reservation. A house where a 10-year-old boy has been spending every single day of his arrested existence proving that chaos is a kind of love, that rebellion is a kind of engagement, that the kid who breaks the rules is still paying attention, is maybe paying more attention than anyone. A house where an 8-year-old girl keeps picking up her saxophone and playing, keeps reading her books, keeps arguing with a world that does not want to be argued with, because she has not yet learned to stop believing that the argument matters. A house where a 1-year-old baby sits in her high chair, watching everything, understanding everything, saying nothing, waiting. That is the show. That is what it has always been. Underneath the nuclear power plants and the billionaires and the theories and the mysteries, a house, a family. The particular love that survives everything because it has been tested by everything and has not broken yet. The show will never confirm any of the theories we have talked about tonight. The writers will never stand up and say, yes, Homer is dreaming. Yes, the radiation is real. Yes, the vote to exile Skinner is the model for every reset. They have declined to do this for 36 years, and they will continue to decline. But the show will also never fully disprove any of them, because the evidence is not in any single episode. It is in the pattern, in the accumulation, in what you see when you step back far enough to take the whole thing in at once, 36 seasons, 788 episodes, an impossible family in an impossible town, living an impossible life with a grace and a resilience and a love that should not survive the conditions it has been asked to survive under. But it does, it always does. Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. The family always ends up on the couch, the credits roll, the world resets, and next week they are there again. Maybe it is radiation. Maybe it is a dream. Maybe it is collective denial. Maybe it is the infrastructure of a billionaire who has spent a century making sure the system cannot change. Maybe it is all 4 at once, operating simultaneously, sustaining each other in ways that no single theory can fully describe. Or maybe the show is telling us something simpler and more frightening than any of those explanations. Maybe the Simpsons keep surviving because they have to, because we need them to, because the version of America that they represent, the chaotic, loving, exhausted, resilient, chronically imperfect middle-class American family, cannot be allowed to fail, cannot be allowed to age, cannot be allowed to change beyond recognition or dissolve into something we do not recognize. As long as The Simpsons is on, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is coming home from the plant and Marge is standing in the kitchen with her improbable hair and her patient heart, we can believe that this version of things is still possible, that the family is still intact, that the house is still standing, that the story is still going. We froze them in 1989 because we needed something to stay still. We pressed pause, and we have been holding it down for 36 years, not because the show cannot move forward, because we cannot afford to watch it end. Springfield is our town. It has always been our town. The yellow faces and the four fingers and the cracked cooling towers and the three-eyed fish, they are us, reflected back in a form strange enough that we could see ourselves without having to admit that we were looking. And Lisa, 8 years old, brilliant and principled and lonely and furious and hopeful, keeps asking the questions that nobody wants to answer. She keeps picking up her saxophone. She keeps reading her books. She keeps pointing at the plant and the fish and the billionaire and the sky that should be blue but sometimes glows. She is the one who has not stopped looking. And we are watching her look, from our side of the screen, from our own particular spot in the world on this particular quiet night. 36 years, 788 episodes, the longest running anything, and the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is whatever town we grew up in. Maybe because Homer is the father we had, or the father we wanted, or the father we are afraid of becoming. Maybe because Marge is the patience we could not always sustain, and the love we could not always explain. Maybe because Bart is who we wanted to be when the rules felt too small, and Lisa is who we meant to be before the world persuaded us otherwise. Maybe because Maggie, sitting there in her high chair with her enormous eyes and her deliberate silence and her extraordinary waiting, maybe Maggie is the part of us that has not spoken yet, that is still watching, that is still deciding. And maybe we keep coming back to Springfield because it is one of the few places left where we are allowed to be unfinished, where the story is still running and the family is still together and nobody has had to say goodbye yet. The cooling towers are still steaming. The fish still has 3 eyes. The old man glows in the dark. And in a house on Evergreen Terrace, in a town that appears on no map, in a loop that started in 1989 and shows no sign of ending, a family sits down on their couch. They are home. For now, so are we. Think about what it means to live your entire life within the radiation perimeter of a facility with 342 safety violations. Not a brief exposure. Not a temporary situation while the violations are addressed. A lifetime. Childhood through adulthood, drinking the same water, breathing the same air, playing in the same parks, eating food grown in the same soil that the runoff from the plant's waste disposal practices has been permeating for decades. The effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure on human biology have been studied extensively in real-world populations. The communities living near Chernobyl after 1986, the populations downwind of nuclear test sites in Nevada during the Cold War-era testing programs, the workers in early nuclear facilities who did not yet have adequate protection and accumulated exposure over years of occupational contact. These real-world cases have produced real data, and the data shows that chronic low-level exposure produces effects that are diffuse and cumulative rather than dramatic and immediate. It changes the odds on various health outcomes. It produces genetic mutations that may not be visible in the original person, but become visible in subsequent generations. It interferes with neurological development in children who are exposed during critical developmental windows. In Springfield, the exposure has been going on long enough that the affected population includes people who were born after the original contamination began. Bart and Lisa and Maggie are second-generation residents, born into an environment that their parents had already been living in for years. Whatever the contamination has done to Homer and Marge at the biological level, their children received as a starting condition rather than as an acquired characteristic. The mutation was already expressed in the parents. The children began from that expressed mutation baseline. This is why the physical characteristics of Springfield residents are so uniform. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the specific proportions of the face and skull, these are not individual variations that happen to be widely shared. They are the stable expression of a population that has been biologically shaped by the same environmental conditions across multiple generations. The shared characteristics are evidence of shared exposure, sustained long enough to become heritable. The show has been quietly documenting this for 36 years. The yellow skin that covers every Springfield resident and no one who comes from outside. The 4 fingers that every Springfield hand has and no outsider's hand shares. The proportional abnormalities that the show's animation choices normalize for the residents and depart from for visitors. These are not style choices. Inside the logic of the show's fiction, they are biological data. Burns knows this data. Burns has access to private medical researchers and a pharmaceutical division and resources for experimental biological research that the scientific community at large does not have access to. He has been managing his own radiation-related biology for over a century. He understands what chronic radiation exposure does to biological systems in the specific, detailed, practical way of someone who has been living with the management problem for a very long time. He knows what his plant has done to the population downstream. He knows it in the same way and with the same level of detail that he knows what his weekly treatment does to his own body. The difference is that he manages his own exposure carefully and precisely with the resources that only his wealth provides, while the population downstream manages nothing because they do not know there is anything to manage. Burns's plant is not just providing electricity, it has been, since it started operating, running an uncontrolled experiment on the human population of Springfield. An experiment in what happens when people are exposed to chronic low-level radiation without their knowledge or consent, without access to the medical management that could mitigate the effects, without even the basic information that they are being exposed. And the person whose job it is to prevent this experiment from continuing is a man with an IQ of 55 and a crayon in his brain who falls asleep at his workstation and once threw a donut into the reactor core. The experiment has been running for decades. The results are visible on every face in Springfield. And in the office upstairs from the reactor, behind a desk with a plutonium paperweight, Burns sits and signs the checks and waits for his next weekly treatment and calculates, with the cold precision of a man who has been doing this for over a century, how long the current arrangement can be sustained? The answer, if the pattern holds, is considerably longer than any of his employees can imagine, which is, of course, precisely the point. There is one more element of the radiation theory that deserves attention before we move on, and it is the element that takes the theory from being a clever interpretation of visual design choices into something that the show has stated in explicit narrative terms across multiple episodes. The town's collective behavior is affected, not just the biology, the psychology. Springfield's residents do not age, and they do not remember, and they do not hold their experiences in ways that produce the kind of sustained, cumulative understanding that should emerge from the things that have happened to them. They live in a perpetual present in which the past does not reliably inform the present, and the lessons of catastrophe do not accumulate into systemic change. They riot about trivial things and absorb enormous things without complaint. They forget, they reset, they start fresh. The coma theory attributes this to Homer's dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The collective denial theory attributes it to a social agreement enforced by institutional mechanisms. Both of these explanations have merit and evidence to support them. But the radiation theory offers a biological substrate for both. If the contamination has been affecting the neurological function of Springfield's residents for decades, then the cognitive impairment that produces their characteristic inability to sustain critical attention, to remember what should be memorable, to act on information that the information itself demands action on, is not a moral failure or a social agreement or a dream state. It is a symptom, a neurological consequence of chronic exposure to the specific kind of environmental contamination that the plant has been producing. The same mechanism that impairs Homer's IQ and keeps his brain operating at 55% of typical capacity is, in milder forms, affecting the entire population. Everyone in Springfield is, to varying degrees, Homer Simpson, running at reduced capacity, finding it easier than they should to accept things that should not be acceptable, forgetting what should not be forgettable, moving through a world that they experience as normal because the exposure has made it feel normal, because the baseline they are measuring against was established by a contaminated environment, because the point of comparison for what is acceptable has always been the thing they are inside. They do not know what normal looks like. They have never lived in a world where the water was clean and the cooling towers were not cracked and the safety inspector was awake at his station. Springfield is the only Springfield they have ever known, and Springfield feels normal to them because it is all they have ever had to compare anything to. The plant made sure of that. The plant made sure they could not see it, and the plant is still running. The coma theory has a dimension that even its most committed advocates tend not to spend much time on, perhaps because it is the dimension that requires the most willingness to sit with something genuinely uncomfortable. If Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then the dream has been running for over 30 years. 30 years of continuous unconscious narrative generated by a brain in a hospital bed in Springfield General is an extraordinary amount of time. It is longer than most people's entire childhood and adolescence combined. It is long enough that the family Homer is dreaming about has, in the real world, changed beyond any recognition that the dreaming Homer could anticipate. The actual Bart Simpson, the real one, the physical one who visited Homer's hospital bedside and wept and confessed and watched his father not wake up, is now in his mid-40s. He has, presumably, become whoever the experience of growing up without a fully present father made him. He has made choices and accumulated a history and become a person shaped by decades of actual life, rather than by the perpetual 10-year-oldness of the dream version. The actual Lisa is in her early 40s. The actual Maggie is in her mid-30s. Homer's children are middle-aged, and in his dream, they are still the ages they were the day the vending machine fell, because that is all his brain has to work with. This is the detail that makes the coma theory genuinely difficult to sit with. It is not just that Homer is missing his family's lives while he dreams about them. It is that the family he is dreaming about is, at this point, a historical document rather than a current reality. The 10-year-old Bart and the 8-year-old Lisa and the 1-year-old Maggie do not exist anymore in the waking world. The dream Homer is running is a dream about people who have not been those people for a very long time. He is dreaming about who they were. And in the dream, they are preserved exactly as they were, because that is all the dream can do. It cannot imagine them into the future because it does not have access to the future. It can only loop through variations of the past, the specific past that existed before April 1993, before the vending machine, before the dream began. Every episode of The Simpsons, since season 4, is Homer dreaming about people who stopped being those versions of themselves 30 years ago. And yet the dream continues to run with the extraordinary fidelity of love. The children are not vague impressions or blurry recollections. They are fully realized, fully voiced, fully present in every detail that Homer's love and attention can sustain. Because the thing that is generating the dream is not just brain function. It is the specific, detailed, total love of a father for his family, which is the most comprehensive form of attention that a human being typically directs at anything. Homer knew his children completely. He knew the specific way Lisa held her saxophone, and the specific quality of Bart's laughter, and the specific weight of Maggie in his arms. He knew these things with the total knowledge of someone who has been paying attention with his whole heart. And that knowledge is what the dream is built from. Every episode since 1993 is Homer dreaming about his family, using every detail of them that his love had managed to record before the lights went out. That is the most devastating possible reading of the show. And it is completely consistent with everything the show has put on screen. Burns's relationship with Smithers requires more examination than it typically receives because the show's comedy treatment of the relationship tends to obscure what the relationship is actually doing and what it actually means for both of them. The comedy layer is familiar. Smithers is devoted to Burns in a way that exceeds professional loyalty and has emotional dimensions that the show plays with considerable consistency across its run. Burns is oblivious to the full depth of Smithers's feelings, or appears to be, in the way that very powerful people are sometimes genuinely unable to see the full reality of the people who serve them. But underneath the comedy, the relationship is a medical dependency structure of extraordinary intimacy and complexity. Smithers manages Burns's life in every dimension simultaneously. He manages the schedule, not just the professional calendar, but the medical calendar, the weekly treatment appointments that are the only thing keeping Burns alive. He manages the staff, the physicians, and researchers and support personnel whose combined effort maintains Burns's biological function. He manages Burns's physical state on a moment-to-moment basis, monitoring for signs of deterioration, watching for the early indicators that the treatment schedule needs adjustment, tracking the variables of Burns's condition with the obsessive attentiveness of someone who knows that missing a signal could be fatal. This is not the work of an assistant. It is the work of a caregiver in the most demanding possible sense, caring for a patient whose condition is so complex and so inherently unstable that the management itself requires something approaching genius-level logistical capacity, sustained over decades without a break. And Smithers does it willingly, not just willingly devotedly. He does it with the total commitment of someone who has decided that this is what his life is for. The show treats this as a comic situation, and it is. But it is also a portrait of a particular kind of devotion that the comedy format makes it easy to undervalue. Smithers has given his entire professional life and considerable portions of his personal life to the project of keeping Charles Montgomery Burns alive. He has done this across decades of service. through every indignity and humiliation that Burns's particular management style produces, through every moment when his own needs and desires and life have been subordinated to the demands of the position. He stays because the alternative is Burns's death. He knows this with a clinical precision that does not admit of romantic idealization. He knows that without his management of the treatment schedule, without his monitoring of Burns's physical state, without his coordination of the medical team, and his management of the logistical infrastructure that the weekly treatment requires, Burns will deteriorate. The treatment will be missed. The disease equilibrium will collapse. Every illness in Burns's body will surge simultaneously, and Burns will die. Smithers is keeping Burns alive through competence, through the total application of his considerable organizational intelligence to the single project of managing the survival of the most powerful man in Springfield. The love that the show implies Smithers has for Burns is real. The show is not being ironic about that. But the love is also not the primary mechanism keeping Smithers in place. The primary mechanism is the knowledge that his absence is a death sentence, and whatever his complex feelings about Burns might be, Smithers is not willing to be responsible for that death. He is, in the most fundamental sense, Burns's life support system. And he knows it, and Burns knows it. And the relationship between them, the comedy and the pathos and the bizarre intimacy of it, is organized entirely around that single, irreducible fact. The Tamzarian episode revealed something about Springfield that the show has been demonstrating indirectly since its earliest seasons. But the revelation was so direct and so uncomfortable that the audience's response was to reject the episode rather than accept what it was showing them. Consider what Springfield has absorbed without formally acknowledging it across the show's run. The nuclear plant's contamination of the local water supply and ecosystem absorbed. Blinky the three-eyed fish is a local celebrity now, a piece of Springfield's identity, a novelty rather than an alarm. The contamination that produced Blinky continues to produce whatever effects it produces in the population downstream, and nobody tests the water, and nobody follows up on the fish study, and the three eyes are just how things are around here. The dome. The federal government sealed Springfield under a dome because the town was classified as an environmental hazard. The dome was removed. The crisis that produced the dome was resolved, or appeared to be resolved, and Springfield resumed normal operations. The fact that the federal government had determined the town to be so fundamentally contaminated that physical containment was the only appropriate response, this fact does not appear to have altered anyone's relationship to the town or to the plant that produced the contamination. The dome happened. Springfield moved on. Burns blocking the sun. He built a device and used it to steal the town's access to natural light as a business strategy. This is an act so extreme that it should have produced permanent consequences: legal, political, social. The wealthiest man in town attempted to control the entire population through control of their access to sunlight itself. And the town's response was a town meeting, a shooting that the investigation concluded with uncertain evidence, and then Burns waking up from his hospital bed and going back to running his empire as though the sun blocking had been a minor administrative overreach rather than an attempt at total environmental control. This is what Springfield does. This is what the show has been depicting, from its earliest seasons, as the fundamental character of the town's relationship to its own reality. Events happen, large events, events that should be determinative, that should alter the trajectory of the community's understanding of itself and its situation, and then they are absorbed, they become background. They become part of the scenery of Springfield, the way the cooling towers are part of the scenery present, acknowledged in a nominal sense, and not producing the kind of sustained attention and action that the facts of the situation clearly demand. The principal and the pauper made this process visible in a way that the audience found unbearable. It showed you the vote, it showed you the mechanism, it showed you Springfield sitting in judgment on the documented truth, and choosing, unanimously, to expel it. The audience's revulsion was the right response to what they were seeing. The mistake was in directing that revulsion at the episode, rather than at what the episode was accurately describing. The episode is not the problem. The episode is the diagnosis. Springfield has always made this choice. Every time, without exception, the episode just showed you the paperwork. Maggie Simpson has been watching all of this. 36 years of high-chair observation. 36 years of listening to conversations that the adults around her assume she cannot follow because she is 1 and 1-year-olds do not follow conversations. 36 years of watching Homer navigate his emotional damage, and Marge manage everything that Homer cannot manage, and Bart burn through his rebellion, and Lisa carry her intelligence into a world that keeps telling her it is not wanted there. 36 years of watching Springfield from the only position that Springfield has never thought to monitor. The baby. Nobody monitors the baby. Nobody attributes to the baby the kind of intelligence that would make monitoring necessary. Nobody looks at the high chair and thinks, that is where the information is being processed. That is where the real analysis of our situation is happening. That is the position in this household from which the most complete picture of what is actually going on has been assembled. They look at the high chair and they see a baby. They hear the pacifier sounds and they register an infant's ambient communication. They notice Maggie when she requires feeding or changing or comforting, and otherwise they go about their business in front of her with the unself-consciousness of people who do not believe they are being observed. They are being observed. They have been observed for 36 years, with the patient, comprehensive, uninterrupted attention of a mind that has nothing else to do but watch and think. The information Maggie has accumulated about the Simpson family alone would fill volumes. She knows Homer's psychology with the completeness of someone who has watched it operate in real time across thousands of episodes without Homer ever being aware of the observation. She knows the specific texture of his emotional damage, the precise shape of his need for approval, the exact threshold at which his coping mechanisms fail, and something more honest emerges briefly before being suppressed again. She knows Marge the way a cartographer knows a territory she has been mapping for decades, every feature of the landscape, every pattern of behavior, every way in which Marge's extraordinary patience conceals an extraordinary capacity that the people around her consistently fail to utilize. She knows Bart's rebellion as the expression of love it actually is, underneath the performance of indifference. She knows Lisa's loneliness not as an unfortunate side effect of her intelligence, but as the specific loneliness of being the only person in a room who can see what everyone else is missing. And she knows herself. She knows what she is capable of, and she knows what the show has told us about the consequences of displaying that capability, and she has made a decision that the show has honored by keeping her silent. The moment Maggie speaks, the moment she decides that the time for watching is over and the time for acting has arrived, will be the most significant event in Springfield's history. Not because of what she does in that moment specifically, but because of everything she has been waiting to do, everything she has been preparing, everything that 36 years of comprehensive observation has been building toward. Springfield does not know it is waiting for something, but Maggie knows. The predictions phenomenon has a dimension that neither the official debunking nor the conspiracy interpretations typically address, and it is the dimension that makes the phenomenon most interesting as a cultural observation. The predictions that have come true are not evenly distributed across subject matter. They cluster around specific categories of American life. Political dysfunction, specifically the elevation of entertainment figures and celebrity personalities into positions of serious political power. Media consolidation, specifically the absorption of smaller media entities into fewer, larger corporate structures. Technology, specifically the miniaturization and personalization of computing power in ways that make it wearable and ubiquitous. Public health, specifically the vulnerability of densely connected populations to novel pathogens. Economic inequality, specifically the accumulation of wealth at levels that produce visible absurdity alongside visible poverty. These are not random subject areas. They are the areas where the show's satirical intelligence was most consistently deployed, and they are the areas where the trajectories it identified were clearest and most persistent. The writers were not predicting randomly across the entire landscape of possible futures. They were identifying the vectors that American society was already moving along and extending them to their logical conclusions. The predictions cluster in these areas because these are the areas where the show was right about the fundamental direction. Not right about specific details necessarily, though sometimes that too. Right about the direction. Right about where the trends were heading. Right about what the trajectory looked like when you followed it far enough. This is what smart satire does, not what propaganda does, which is to construct a specific preferred narrative. Not what journalism does, which is to document what has already happened. Satire looks at what is happening and identifies its inner logic and extrapolates that logic forward until the absurdity becomes visible. The absurdity was always there. The satire just made it visible by advancing the timeline. The predictions feel prophetic because the things they predicted were already in process when the episodes were written. The writers saw the process clearly enough to describe its endpoint. And when the endpoint arrived, the audience recognized it with the specific shock of something that feels both inevitable and impossible at once, the way that a thing you have been watching approach for a long time feels when it finally arrives. The Simpsons saw America clearly. It described what it saw in the language of cartoon comedy, which gave the descriptions a specific kind of permission. You could laugh at the description without fully committing to believing it as diagnosis. And then the diagnosis turned out to be right. That is not prophecy. That is clarity. The show was clear-eyed about America in ways that America itself was not always willing to be, and the consequence of that clarity is a catalog of observations that keep matching reality because the reality they observed was already there. The geography mystery has a human dimension that the theoretical frameworks tend to obscure in their focus on the structural and political explanations for Springfield's unlocatability. Springfield is where you need it to be. This is not just a production decision or a joke about the show's universal appeal. It is, for the people who love the show most deeply, a genuine emotional fact. If you grew up in a small Midwestern city with a declining industrial base and a powerful employer who dominated the local economy in ways that everyone understood but nobody said directly, Springfield is your town. If you grew up in a New England village with the specific insularity of old communities that know their own history so thoroughly that anyone who arrived after a certain point can never quite belong, Springfield is your town. If you grew up in a southern small city with the particular texture of a community organized around relationships and hierarchies that outsiders cannot fully read, Springfield is your town. The geographic impossibility that the theories interpret as a legal shield or a radiation effect or a dream construction is also simply the show's way of honoring the fact that the American experience it is depicting is not specific to a single region. The nuclear power plant and the corrupt billionaire and the family in the modest house on the quiet street and the school that is always short on funding and the local tavern that serves as community center for people who have no other place to gather, these exist in every region of the fray. Country, in forms specific to each region but recognizable across all of them. Springfield is unlocalizable because it is everywhere. And it is everywhere because the conditions it depicts are not regional conditions. They are American conditions. The show did not set out to critique a specific geography. It set out to describe a specific kind of life. And that kind of life exists in every state and every region and every climate and every landscape that the country contains. The mountains and the ocean and the desert and the farmland all coexist in Springfield, not because the writers were careless about geography, but because the show's subject matter requires a geography as broad as its subject. You cannot pin America's working-class family to a single state without losing the universality that makes the family mean what it means. So Springfield floats. So the geography shifts. So the borders change with the episode. And so millions of people in millions of specific places watch the show and find their specific place in it, because the show has been careful never to close the door by locating itself too precisely anywhere. The floating timeline has another dimension that tends to go unexamined, and it is the dimension that most directly addresses the question of why the show continues after all these years and what it is still providing that its audience needs. The Simpsons represents a specific historical moment in American life, the late 1980s and early 1990s, the moment when the show began with the particular completeness of something that recorded that moment in enough detail that the record feels comprehensive. The economic conditions of the late 1980s working class, the cultural landscape of that specific era, the texture of family life in a time before the internet and the smartphone and the economic disruptions that have transformed the conditions of working-class life in the decades since. Homer's life in 1989 was a specific kind of life that was possible in 1989. He could support a family on a single income from a non-managerial position at an industrial facility. He could own a home. He could afford a car and a television and regular restaurant meals, and a decent quality of life measured in the ordinary terms that the show depicts his ordinary life as having. This was possible for a man of Homer's qualifications in his economic moment. It has become increasingly less possible in the decades since. The conditions that made Homer's life achievable have been eroded by economic restructuring, by the decline of union power, by the stagnation of wages relative to costs, by all the forces that have made the specific kind of stability that Homer's life represents harder and harder to maintain in practice. The floating timeline has kept Homer's life intact, while the conditions that would make that life possible have been progressively dismantled in the real world. Springfield has stayed affordable. The plant has kept paying Homer at a level that supports his family. The house has stayed accessible. The quality of life that the show depicts as normal has remained available to Homer in Springfield, even as the real-world analog of that quality of life has become harder to reach for the people watching the show. This is part of what the audience is watching when they watch The Simpsons. They are watching a version of the life that they were promised, the working-class stability, the adequate income, the modest but real comfort of the house and the family, and the quiet street preserved in amber on the screen, while the real version becomes increasingly unavailable. Springfield is not just a cartoon town, it is a memory palace for a version of American life that is fading. And the floating timeline that keeps Homer's economic conditions stable, keeps his home affordable, keeps his job secure despite everything. The floating timeline is the show's refusal to let that version of things go, even as the real world lets go of it more every year. That is why we cannot let them go. Not just because we love them, though we do, because they represent something we do not want to acknowledge losing. A version of things that felt possible once. A version of the American middle class that the show has been preserving, in the only way available to it, across 36 years of cultural and economic change. Springfield stays the same because the thing it represents should stay the same, but hasn't. And watching it stay the same is a way of insisting, quietly and persistently, that it should have. There is a final convergence of all the theories we have spent this night with, a point at which the radiation theory and the coma theory and the collective denial theory and the Burns immortality theory and the prediction theory all arrive at the same place from their different directions and find each other, there, waiting. The convergence point is this. Springfield exists in a state of impossible continuity because the forces acting on it environmental, biological, psychological, social, economic all push in the direction of continuity rather than change. The contamination impairs the critical thinking that would produce change. The coma dream cannot generate change because the dreamer was not there to witness it. The collective denial actively suppresses change by treating truth as a criminal offense. Burns's wealth is designed to prevent the changes that would threaten it. The show's cultural influence shapes the futures it describes in ways that confirm its own observations. All of these forces push in the same direction. All of them sustain Springfield in its impossible, frozen, self-reinforcing state. None of them is strong enough alone to explain the full picture. All of them together describe something that is coherent and disturbing and, in the end, genuinely moving. Because the thing they sustain, through all their various mechanisms, is a family. Not a perfect family. Not an ideal family. A family full of damage and impairment and denial, and love and comedy and sadness, and the particular exhausting resilience of people who keep getting knocked down and keep getting back up, not because they are strong in any conventional sense, but because the alternative is not having each other, and that alternative is unacceptable. That is Springfield. That is what every theory, every mystery, every thread we have followed tonight is ultimately a different way of describing. A family that should not still be together, given everything that has happened to it and everything that has been done to it and everything that the systems around it have conspired to produce. A family that has survived the contamination and the coma and the lies and the billionaire's grudge and the town's collective forgetting and the floating timeline and the geographic impossibility. A family that keeps sitting down on its couch every Sunday night at 8 and being together. The credits roll. The couch gag plays. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie arrange themselves on the couch and look at the television, and the episode begins, and the world outside Springfield continues to turn and change and complicate itself, and the family on the couch stays exactly as they are, frozen in love, preserved by it, sustained by it across every force that should have dissolved them by now. That is the show. That is the whole show. Every theory points at it, and every mystery circles it, and every impossible thing that happens in Springfield and gets forgotten by the next episode is in service of it. A family on a couch. Still together. Still there. And as long as we keep watching, they always will be. The night is winding down now. Springfield is quiet. The cooling towers send their steam into the dark sky, and the Quickie Mart sign flickers at the empty corner. And the house on Evergreen Terrace sits still and small under the particular stillness that small houses have in the very late hours when everything inside has gone to sleep. Homer is on the couch. He fell asleep watching television, as he often does, and the television went on talking to itself in the dark living room while he slept. He is dreaming about something. Whether that something is the show we have been watching together, or whether the show we have been watching is something he is dreaming, the theories cannot finally resolve. Marge is upstairs. She is asleep in the way of someone who has been managing more than anyone around her knows, and who sleeps, therefore, with a depth and a thoroughness that is the body's accounting for what the day required of it. She will be up before the alarm. She is always up before the alarm. Bart is in his room. His skateboard is leaning against the wall. His slingshot is on the nightstand. He is asleep with the specific sprawl of a 10-year-old boy who has not yet learned to take up only his own allotted space in the world. Lisa is in her room. Her saxophone is on its stand in the corner. She fell asleep reading, the book still open on the bed beside her, and she is dreaming about something that has the feeling of an argument she is winning. And Maggie is in her crib. Her eyes are closed. She is breathing with the slow, even rhythm of deep sleep. Her pacifier moves slightly with each breath. Or maybe she is not asleep. Maybe those enormous eyes are open in the dark, watching the ceiling, processing. Maybe she has been lying awake in that crib for 36 years, thinking about everything she has seen and everything she knows and everything she is waiting to do with it. Maybe she is the only person in the house who is fully awake. Springfield will never tell you. Some mysteries are more valuable as questions than as answers. Some shows are more valuable for what they make you wonder than for what they actually say. And some families, the impossible, improbable, radiation-contaminated or coma-dreamed or collectively denial-sustained families mean more than any theory can fully contain, because what they mean is not a proposition or a reading or an interpretation. What they mean is that the house is still standing. The family is still together. And wherever you are tonight, whatever your own version of Evergreen Terrace looks like, whatever your own house holds, or used to hold, or might hold someday, Springfield is still there. It always is. There is a reading of The Simpsons that treats the secondary characters, the residents of Springfield beyond the Simpson family, as supporting cast in a story about a family. Characters who exist to provide context and comedy and the social texture of a community. Characters whose function is to make Springfield feel populated and whose individual stories are secondary to the main family's arc. This reading is incomplete. The secondary characters of Springfield are not scenery. They are, in many cases, the most honest part of the show's diagnosis of the town and the forces operating within it. And a careful look at several of them reveals dimensions of what Springfield is and what it does to its residents that the Simpson family's story, being too close to the center, cannot see clearly. Chief Clancy Wiggum is one of the most important characters in the show, and the one whose importance is most thoroughly obscured by the comedy surrounding him. Wiggum is the chief of the Springfield Police Department. He is the head of the town's law enforcement apparatus, the person ultimately responsible for the security and the legal protection of Springfield's residents. Wiggum is spectacularly incompetent, not slightly ineffective or occasionally prone to errors of judgment. Spectacularly, comprehensively, almost artistically incompetent in ways that the show depicts with relentless consistency across 36 seasons. He does not solve crimes. He does not protect people. He does not enforce laws with anything resembling consistency or seriousness. His relationship with the concept of justice is theoretical rather than practical. His department is an apparatus that exists, produces paperwork, and has essentially no functional impact on the actual safety or legal protection of Springfield's residents. This is funny. The show makes it funny. Chief Wiggum is a comedy character, and his incompetence is a reliable source of comedy that the show has used effectively since his earliest appearances. But Wiggum's incompetence is also the reason that Burns has never faced legal consequences for the 342 safety violations. It is the reason that the human skeletons in the plant's basement were never investigated. It is the reason that the shooting of Burns was resolved with a conclusion that the evidence does not fully support. It is the reason that Molman can die repeatedly in public view and no investigation ever follows. It is the reason that the town's collective agreement to sustain comfortable lies over documented truths is never threatened by legal accountability. Springfield's law enforcement is incompetent enough to make the town's existing power structure invulnerable to accountability through normal legal mechanisms. Whether this is accidental or whether Burns's influence has shaped the police department the way it has shaped everything else in Springfield is a question the show raises without answering. But the effect is the same regardless of the cause. Springfield has a police department that cannot and does not hold power accountable, and the absence of that accountability is what makes the rest of the town's impossible situation sustainable. The law is supposed to be the mechanism that prevents someone like Burns from doing what Burns does. The law is supposed to be the external constraint that makes the violation list matter, that makes the contamination actionable, that makes the shooting a case rather than a story. And Springfield's law enforcement is the absence of that mechanism. It is the vacuum that exists where accountability should be, filling the space without providing the function. Wiggum is not the villain of this story. He is not a corrupt cop in the conventional sense, deliberately accepting bribes to look away from specific crimes. He is something more systemic and in some ways more troubling. A genuinely incompetent man who occupies a position of genuine authority and whose occupancy of that position ensures that the authority is never actually exercised in the ways that would matter most. He is the perfect police chief for a town that runs on collective denial. He cannot see what the town has agreed not to see. He cannot investigate what the town has agreed not to investigate. Not because he is part of the conspiracy, he almost certainly is not part of anything that requires the sophistication of a conspiracy, but because his natural incompetence happens to align perfectly with the town's structural need for non-enforcement. Springfield's safety is not managed by Wiggum. Springfield's safety is managed, in the specific sense of being made impossible to enforce, by Wiggum's presence in the role where enforcement would otherwise happen. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon and the Quickie Mart represent a dimension of Springfield's character that the show has sometimes handled with more complexity than it gets credit for. The Quickie Mart is the one constant across Springfield's geography present in every version of the town's layout, functioning as the community's default convenience resource, open at hours when nothing else is, selling things that nobody particularly needs and that everyone regularly purchases. Apu has managed this store for the entirety of the show's run. He has a doctorate from the Calcutta Institute of Technology. He is, by any academic measure, one of the most educated people in Springfield, certainly more formally educated than most of the people who come into his store and address him with the casual condescension that the show sometimes depicts and sometimes challenges. The Quickie Mart is a franchise. Apu does not own the store in any meaningful sense. He manages it on behalf of the Quickie Mart corporate structure, which the show depicts in one episode as a near-religious organization based in India, presided over by a figure of apparently divine corporate authority who is accessible only after elaborate ritual. The store's conditions are set from above. The pricing is set from above. The hours are set from above. Apu's freedom within the position is narrow. And yet Apu has stayed, for 36 seasons, in a position that requires extraordinary hours and pays, presumably, within a franchise structure that skims the majority of profit upward while the franchise operator works the counter at 3 in the morning. The show has various explanations for why Apu stays the immigration status that complicates alternative employment options, the family considerations that emerged when Apu became a father, the specific community attachments that have formed across years of operating the corner store that everyone comes to. These are real factors, individually and in combination. But there is also the possibility that the radiation theory applies to Apu in a specific way. If decades of residence in Springfield have impaired the critical thinking that would otherwise drive someone to examine their situation and make changes, then Apu's continued management of the Quickie Mart is not just a product of rational calculation within constrained options. It is also a product of the same cognitive impairment that keeps Homer at the plant and keeps the residents from asking about the three-eyed fish. Apu stays because Springfield residents stay. Because the capacity to leave to look clearly at the situation and decide that the situation is worth leaving requires a form of cognitive independence that the town's contaminated environment has been eroding. Systematically, the Quickie Mart is the town's convenience store. It is open when nothing else is. It is there when you need it. And the man behind the counter has a doctorate and knows more than most of the people who treat him as scenery, and he has been standing there for 36 years. And the show has not always known what to do with the complexity of that. Krusty the Clown is one of the show's great sustained tragedies, dressed as comedy, and the tragedy is the specific tragedy of someone who has spent their entire life being professionally something they are not, and has lost track of whether there is anything left of what they actually are. Herschel Schmoikel, Pinchas Yaruchim Krustovsky, was born Krusty the Clown. This is not quite accurate. He was born the son of a rabbi. with a name and a heritage and a relationship to a specific tradition, and he became Krusty through the choice to pursue a career in entertainment rather than the rabbinical path his father had envisioned for him. His father did not speak to him for decades because of this choice. The estrangement was profound and long-lasting, sustained across the entirety of Krusty's career, through his rise to regional television prominence, through his various personal disasters and professional recoveries, through everything that made Krusty Krusty. And Krusty's career, viewed from inside rather than from the audience's perspective, is a picture of a man who has been performing a version of joy for so long that he has lost whatever relationship he once had to actual joy. He is a children's entertainer. His professional persona is warmth and laughter, and the uncomplicated delight of a clown whose purpose is to make children happy. And Krusty himself is deeply, persistently, constitutionally unhappy in ways that he does not bother to conceal from the adults in his life, because he no longer has the energy to maintain the performance off-camera. He smokes, he gambles, he makes professional decisions with a recklessness that has produced multiple bankruptcies and career collapses across the show's run. He treats the people who work for him with a casual indifference that is the indifference of someone who has stopped seeing other people as fully real, which is often what happens to people who spend their professional lives performing rather than relating. The estrangement from his father is the wound underneath all of this. Krusty chose his career over his father's vision for him, and his father chose the vision over the relationship, and they both lost decades to the standoff. When the show eventually resolves the estrangement through Bart's intervention, in one of the episodes that the show handles with more emotional directness than usual, the relief is genuine, and the resolution is satisfying. The father and son find their way back to each other. But the decades are not recoverable. The years of Krusty performing joy for children while being disconnected from any actual joy cannot be undone by the reconciliation. The professional persona that became the whole of his identity cannot be unwound back to whatever he was before Krusty was everything. Krusty is what the show is willing to suggest happens when you spend decades performing something you are not in a town that cannot sustain the difference between performance and reality. Springfield rewards the performance. It accepts Krusty the Clown as a genuine community figure, a local celebrity, a meaningful presence in the lives of its children. It does not and cannot accommodate Herschel Kristofsky, who is a sad, tobacco-dependent, financially irresponsible man with a complicated relationship to his father and no apparent inner life. The performance is all Springfield wants. The performance is what Springfield knows how to receive. In a town where reality is systematically managed and truth is occasionally made illegal, performance is the only safe mode of self-presentation. Krusty learned this professionally. The lesson the show draws from his career is that learning it professionally is not that different from learning it personally, and that the distinction between the two eventually dissolves. Sideshow Bob's story is the one that most directly implicates the entire system of Springfield's reality in the specific way the theories have been tracing. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. Sideshow Bob is, within the show's universe, a man of genuine intelligence and considerable education who has spent his adult life in Springfield in a relationship of total mutual destruction with a 10-year-old boy. The relationship between Bob and Bart is one of the show's great running premises, and its longevity is as impossible as every other impossible thing in Springfield. The 10-year-old child and the adult genius have been locked in their particular dance for 36 years, and neither of them has aged, and neither of their positions has fundamentally changed. Bob has tried to kill Bart, repeatedly, with increasing elaborateness. The attempts have failed due to the specific combination of Bart's resourcefulness, Bob's tendency to monologue at critical moments, and the general impossibility that governs Springfield's relationship with consequence. But the Bob and Bart dynamic is not what is most interesting about Sideshow Bob. What is most interesting is the show's ambivalence about what Bob is and what he represents, and whether the life he has in Springfield is the right life for someone of his capacities. Bob is, by any measure, the most intellectually capable recurring character on the show. He speaks multiple languages. He has extensive knowledge of opera and literature and history. He is a skilled strategist, capable of constructing elaborate plans that account for multiple contingencies and that require sustained cognitive engagement to execute. His schemes, when they fail because of specific unforeseen circumstances, rather than because of any fundamental flaw in the intelligence that constructed them. and he has spent his adult life as a cartoon villain in a town that resists taking anything seriously enough to provide a worthy adversary. Springfield is not the place for someone of Bob's capacities. Springfield is, by its nature and by the forces we have been discussing, a place that suppresses the kind of sustained critical intelligence that Bob possesses. The contamination, the collective denial, the managed reality, all of these create an environment that is fundamentally hostile to the kind of mind Bob has, which may be why he keeps coming back. Not just because of Bart, though the fixation on Bart is real and the show examines it with genuine curiosity about what drives it, but because Springfield, for all its hostility to intelligence, is the only place where Bob can be fully himself, the only place where his intelligence is relevant, the only place where his schemes, however repeatedly unsuccessful, are taken seriously enough to matter. Outside Springfield, Bob is just a man with a criminal record and an impressive rake of academic accomplishments, and no particular place in the world. Inside Springfield, he is Sideshow Bob, arch nemesis, brilliant villain, the most significant threat the town has ever faced from within its own permanent population. The town that suppresses intelligence has given this particular intelligent man the only context in which his intelligence has ever felt consequential. He cannot leave. Not just because the show requires him not to leave, because Springfield, as horrible as it is for him, is the only place he exists in 3 dimensions. The teachers at Springfield Elementary are worth a brief examination, because they represent the specific tragedy of people who are trying to do something genuinely valuable in a system that makes it structurally impossible. Mrs. Krabappel, who remained Bart's teacher for most of the show's run until the actress who voiced her passed away in 2013, was depicted across many episodes as a woman who had entered teaching with genuine idealism and had accumulated, over decades of working in Springfield's educational system, a layer of protective cynicism that was thick enough to survive anything but thin enough that you could still see the idealism underneath when the show chose to look. She cared about Bart. Despite everything, despite his pranks and his deliberate obstruction of every educational effort she directed toward him and his fundamental commitment to being ungovernable within her classroom, she cared about him. The show depicted this with unusual honesty about what caring about a student who resists you actually feels like. Frustrating, occasionally futile, and entirely irreplaceable as a professional experience. The educational system she worked within was catastrophically underfunded, not just because of Burns's oil theft, but as a baseline condition. Springfield Elementary had inadequate resources before the oil theft and continues to have inadequate resources after the oil theft because the oil theft was the dramatic crystallization of an ongoing problem rather than its cause. The school runs on insufficient money. Its teachers work in classrooms with insufficient materials. Its students come from homes where the pressures of economic insecurity make the focus required for learning difficult to sustain. And the teachers do their jobs anyway, within the system they have, with the resources available to them, against all the structural resistance that Springfield's particular situation creates. This is not a miracle. It is the ordinary heroism of people who chose a profession because they believed in it, and who sustained that belief through conditions that were not what they were promised when they chose it. It is common. It is unremarked upon most of the time. The show depicts it with the casualness of depicting anything that is simply true and always present and not dramatic enough to require special attention. But it is part of what Springfield is. Part of the texture of a town where the systems are failing and the people within the systems try anyway, because the alternative is abandoning the people who depend on those systems, and that alternative is not something most people can actually bring themselves to choose. The bars of Springfield Moe's Tavern specifically are the town's true community centers. Not the church, not the school, not the town hall. Moe's? This is where the community's social life actually happens, where the information actually circulates, where the people who hold Springfield together by simply being present in each other's lives actually gather. Moe Sislak, the tavern's owner and bartender, is one of the show's most consistently complex characters, which is not always apparent through the comedy that surrounds him. He is chronically unloved by his own account, and by the evidence of his life as the show depicts it. His romantic experiences uniformly end in failure. His relationship with his customers is genuine in ways that matter to him and transactional in ways that are honest about what a bar is. He occupies a role in Springfield's social architecture that nobody explicitly values and nobody could replace. The bar itself has been bankrupted, burned, destroyed, condemned, and closed across various episodes, and it has been rebuilt or restored each time. Because Springfield needs Moe's Tavern. The town does not have anywhere else to go. The bar is not a luxury or an amenity. It is an infrastructure element, as essential to the functioning of the community as the power lines or the water supply, and considerably more reliable than either. Moe knows this, not in a self-congratulatory way. He does not carry his role in Springfield's social ecology as a source of pride or significance. He carries it the way you carry the thing that is yours to carry because you happened to be in the position when it needed carrying and you stayed. He stayed because the bar is his. Because the people who come every day are his people, in the specific way that the people who show up at your bar every day are your people, regardless of whether you have chosen them or they have chosen you. Because leaving would mean abandoning the only community Moe has ever had, and whatever Moe's relationship to Springfield's collective dysfunction might be, he cannot abandon the community that constitutes his entire social world. Moe is one of the most useful characters in the show for understanding what keeps Springfield going, despite everything the theories have identified about what Springfield is. Not the radiation or the coma or the denial or the billionaire's grip. The thing that keeps Springfield going is the same thing that keeps any community going when everything is wrong with it. The people who stay, the people who show up every day, the people who maintain the relationships and the routines and the shared presence that constitute community in its most basic form. Independent of whether the community is healthy or functional or safe, Springfield is poisoned and possibly dreamed and definitely in denial about its own reality. And it is also a place where people know each other, where the bartender knows what you drink before you order it, where the neighbor helps you rebuild your house even if the house falls down immediately after. The poison and the community coexist. The denial and the genuine love coexist. The radiation and the real relationships coexist. This is what makes Springfield feel like a real place rather than a thought experiment. Real places are like this. Real communities hold their dysfunction and their humanity in the same hands simultaneously. The things that are wrong with them do not eliminate the things that are right with them, and the things that are right with them do not excuse the things that are wrong. Springfield is both. It has always been both. And that specific bothness, the catastrophic and the tender existing in the same zip code, the contamination and the love running through the same water is the most honest thing the show has ever depicted about what communities actually are. The Springfield Elementary School Choir, in an episode from the mid-seasons, briefly becomes an international phenomenon. This is the kind of premise that the show delivers with a straight face and then follows to whatever absurd conclusion it reaches, and the conclusion in this case involves the choir performing at events that a school choir from a modestly funded public school in a mid-sized American town would not realistically attend. But the premise itself is worth sitting with briefly, because the choir is one of those small, specific things that the show uses to suggest that Springfield contains genuine talent and genuine beauty alongside everything that is wrong with it. The children of Springfield can sing. They are yellow and four-fingered, and growing up in a contaminated environment with an impaired police department and a school that is perpetually underfunded, and a billionaire who has been alive for over a century managing their parents' lives through economic pressure, and they can stand together and produce something that is beautiful. This is not nothing. In fact, in the context of everything else the show has established about Springfield, it might be the most important thing. The capacity for beauty persisting inside the contamination zone. The thing that the radiation and the denial and the reset button cannot eliminate. The thing that keeps happening despite everything that has been done to the town and everyone in it. Children singing. In a school that is always short of money. In a town that has three-eyed fish in its rivers. Singing anyway. The beauty is real even inside the catastrophe. The catastrophe does not make the beauty false. Both are true simultaneously. Both have always been true about Springfield. Both are true about every real place that contains both simultaneously, which is every real place there is. The show has always known this. Its most affecting moments are the moments when it holds both truths in the same frame at once, when the comedy and the genuine tenderness occupy the same scene without either one dissolving the other. That is what the show does better than any other piece of American television. Not the satire, though the satire is sharp. Not the predictions, though some of them are startling. Not the mysteries, though they are genuine and fascinating and worth the time we have spent with them tonight. What it does better than anything else is hold the catastrophe and the love at the same time. In the same yellow hands. In the same impossible town. In the same family, on the same couch, on the same street that cannot be found on any map. Springfield is wrong. Springfield is broken. Springfield is contaminated and dreamed, and collectively denying its own reality, and governed by a man who has been alive for a century and a half through mechanisms that should not be possible. And the children can sing, and Homer always finds his way home. And Marge is waiting. And that is everything. That is the whole show. That is all 36 seasons, and all 788 episodes, and all the theories and all the mysteries and all the impossible things that happen in this impossible place. The catastrophe and the love, held simultaneously, in Springfield, which is everywhere, which is yours. There is something worth examining about the way The Simpsons depicts media and entertainment within Springfield's own universe, because Springfield's internal media landscape is a compressed and exaggerated version of the same forces that the show has been critiquing from the outside for 36 years. Kent Brockman is the anchor of Springfield's local news. He has been the town's primary information intermediary for the entirety of the show's run, the face that appears on the television screen to tell Springfield what is happening, to frame the events of the town in terms that the town can receive and process. Brockman is not a bad journalist in the sense of being corrupt or deliberately dishonest. He is a bad journalist in a more systemic and ultimately more interesting sense. He is a journalist who has been in the business long enough to understand that his job is not the transmission of truth, but the performance of authority. His presentation of events is confident regardless of whether the underlying facts support confidence. His framing of issues reflects the path of least institutional resistance rather than the demands of accurate contextualization. His coverage of Springfield's many and various crises follows the patterns of urgency and resolution that television news has established as its form, regardless of whether the specific situation actually resolves or whether the resolution is genuine. When Burns blocks out the sun, Brockman covers it as news. When the dome goes up, Brockman covers it as news. When Molman is found dead somewhere, Brockman moves on to the next story. When the safety inspection reveals 342 violations, the story appears in the cycle and then disappears when Burns eats the three-eyed fish on television. Brockman does not investigate, he reports. The distinction is important and the show understands it. Investigation requires sustained attention, institutional resources, editorial commitment, and the willingness to pursue a story through the resistance that powerful interests routinely apply to stories that threaten them. Reporting the story that presents itself, covering the event as it announces itself, reading the statement as it is delivered, this is a much more manageable professional undertaking, and it is what Brockman does. The result is a news apparatus that is present for every event in Springfield's life, and that produces essentially no accountability for anything. Burns's violations are covered. Burns's influence over the coverage is not covered. The three-eyed fish is reported. The follow-up study that would establish whether the same contamination is affecting the human population is not reported, because it was never conducted, and it was never conducted partly because the news apparatus did not sustain enough pressure to make it necessary. Springfield's media is the mirror image of Springfield's law enforcement. The police cannot hold power accountable because they are incompetent. The news cannot hold power accountable because it is compliant. Both absences serve the same function. Both leave the same vacuum. Both produce the same result. A town in which the mechanisms that are supposed to constrain the exercise of power do not operate effectively enough to matter. Burns does not need to actively corrupt Brockman the way he actively maintains Homer in his position or actively suppresses the safety violation costs. He does not need to. The news apparatus's own institutional incentives do the work for him. Television news wants conflict but not complexity, urgency but not sustained attention, resolution but not genuine accountability. Burns provides the resolution, he eats the fish, he makes the statement, he writes the check that allows the immediate crisis to be declared over, and the news apparatus accepts the resolution because accepting it is what the format requires. Springfield is never truly held accountable in its own media, because its own media is not designed for accountability. It is designed for content. And Burns, who has been managing public relations for over a century, knows the difference between providing accountability and providing content, and has never confused the two. The entertainment that Springfield produces and consumes is worth examining alongside its news. Krusty the Clown, as we discussed earlier, is the town's primary children's entertainer. But the Krusty the Clown show also represents something about how Springfield mediates between the world and its children, how it shapes what children expect entertainment to be, what relationship they develop with the media figures who appear in their living rooms through the television set. Children grow up watching Krusty perform joy, not experiencing joy. Exactly, Krusty is not bringing them into a genuinely joyful experience, but performing one for them, creating the appearance of joy through the technical expertise of a professional comedian who has been doing it long enough that the technique is invisible even to him. The children of Springfield grow up understanding entertainment as performance rather than experience. This shapes them, not dramatically, not in ways that produce immediate visible consequences, but consistently, in the way that anything consistently absorbed shapes the people who absorb it. Springfield's children learn to receive joy passively, rather than to generate it actively. They learn that entertainment is something that comes from a television, rather than something that emerges from engagement with the world and with each other. They learn to watch rather than to participate. Bart and Lisa and Maggie are all, in different ways, departures from this pattern. Bart generates his own entertainment through engagement with the world, through the physical risk-taking and the social provocation and the creative mischief that constitutes his relationship to being alive. Lisa generates her own meaning through intellectual engagement, through music and reading and the sustained interrogation of everything around her. Maggie, in her silence, is doing something that resembles neither of them, but may exceed both. They are, in this reading, the characters who have resisted the passive entertainment culture that Springfield's media landscape produces and maintained some form of active engagement with their own experience. Not perfectly, not without contradiction, but persistently. This may be part of why they feel more real than Springfield's background population. The background residents, the ones who watch Krusty and receive Brockman and absorb the town's managed reality without sustained friction, are more thoroughly shaped by the forces operating on them. The Simpson family, through various combinations of accident and character, have maintained some degree of resistance. Not enough to change anything, not enough to escape the contamination or the loop or the denial, but enough to keep feeling like people rather than symptoms. The Simpsons' relationship to money is one of the show's most consistently honest and least commented upon elements. Homer earns approximately what a man in his position and era would earn. This has been established through specific salary references across various episodes, and the number is always consistent with what a middle-tier worker at an industrial facility would receive in whatever era the floating timeline currently occupies. It is enough, barely, to support his family at the level the show depicts. The house, the car, the regular restaurant meals, the beer, the occasional crisis, the math works, at the edge, if nothing goes catastrophically wrong. Things catastrophically go wrong regularly. The show depicts Homer's financial situation with a specificity that its comedy format often obscures. The financial crises in the Simpsons household are not abstract. They are the specific financial crises of a family living without margin. The unexpected medical bill, the car repair that exceeds the repair budget, the crisis that requires the credit card that should not be used. These are the financial experiences of the majority of American families, the ones for whom stability is not a baseline condition, but a continuous active maintenance project that can be disrupted by events that more economically secure families would absorb without consequence. Homer's salary keeps the family on the edge. The edge is maintained. They do not fall off it, because the show requires that they do not fall off it, but they live on it continuously, with the specific anxiety of edge dwelling that pervades the show's more honest moments. This is another dimension of what the radiation theory might be explaining. If the contamination has impaired the cognitive capacity of Springfield's residents, then they cannot access the full range of economic options that their labor should entitle them to. They cannot organize effectively because organization requires the kind of sustained collective intelligence that the contamination has been eroding. They cannot make career decisions that would improve their economic position because doing so requires the ability to see their situation clearly and identify paths forward from it, and the contamination interferes with that kind of clear seeing. They are held, economically, by the same forces that hold them biologically and cognitively. The economic precarity is a product of the same conditions that produce the three-eyed fish. The contamination does not just affect the body. It affects the capacity for the kind of self-determination that would allow the body's situation to be improved. And Burns, who owns the plant that is producing the contamination and who employs a significant proportion of Springfield's working population, benefits from this in the most direct possible way. A workforce that cannot effectively advocate for itself, cannot coordinate its interests, cannot clearly see the relationship between its working conditions and its economic outcomes. This is the most accommodating possible workforce from a management perspective. It is the workforce that exists in Springfield, where the union that should be fighting for Homer's interests is a recurring minor character notable for its ineffectiveness. The economics of Springfield are not an accident, they are a system. The system is maintained by the same forces that maintain everything else about the town, and the town does not see the system clearly, because the system has made sure that it cannot. There is a quieter mystery in The Simpsons that deserves a moment of attention before we bring everything together for the last time tonight. Springfield has a significant artistic community. The show depicts this intermittently, and without making too much of it, musicians and painters and writers appear as minor characters. There is a reference to a jazz scene that Lisa engages with. There is the cultural programming at various institutions that the show occasionally uses as a setting. Springfield, for all its dysfunction, has people in it who are making things. This is not remarkable in isolation. Every community has people in it who make things, regardless of what else is going on. The creative impulse is not defeated by contamination or denial or economic precarity. If anything, the creative impulse is often most vivid under pressure, in the places and situations where ordinary life offers the least comfortable accommodation. What is worth noting about Springfield's artists is that they tend to be the characters who most clearly see what is happening in the town. Not because artists are uniquely perceptive in a mystical sense, this is a romantic notion that does not survive much examination, but because artistic practice, in its more sustained and serious forms, requires sustained and serious attention to something. It requires looking at the world with enough specificity and enough commitment that the looking eventually produces real observation rather than the comfortable approximation that most perception settles for. The musicians in Springfield's jazz scene see the town differently from the residents who are not looking at it with that kind of attention. The visual artists who are drawing the town see it differently. The writers who are writing about it see it differently. Not correctly, necessarily artistic perception produces its own distortions, but differently, in ways that sometimes reveal things that the standard perception of the contaminated, denial-maintaining, dream state population misses. Lisa is an artist. This is the dimension of her character that the show most consistently returns to when it wants to show her at her most genuinely herself. The saxophone is not incidental. It is the practice through which Lisa maintains the most direct access to her own perception, the most unmediated relationship with her own experience, the clearest window onto whatever Springfield actually is. When Lisa plays, she is doing the thing that the radiation and the collective denial and the coma and the billionaire's grip have failed to take from her. She is paying attention with her whole self to something real. She is generating genuine experience rather than consuming managed experience. She is, in the middle of Springfield's impossible reality, being awake. She cannot fix Springfield. She cannot change it. She cannot make the fish have two eyes, or make the cooling towers stop leaking, or make the town vote for truth rather than comfort. She is 8 years old, and even if she were 800, she probably could not do those things, because the forces maintaining Springfield are larger than any individual's power to overcome. But she plays the saxophone. She keeps asking the questions. She keeps looking at the world and refusing to accept the first explanation offered for what she sees. That is the thing that survives everything in Springfield, the thing that the radiation and the coma and the denial and the loop have not been able to eliminate. The persistent, stubborn, completely individual act of paying attention, Lisa paying attention, Bart paying attention in his own way, through the disruption that insists on seeing what the rules are set up to ignore. Maggie paying attention in her chosen silence, accumulating observations with the patience of someone who is in no hurry because she knows the moment will come. And Homer, in the coma or out of it, asleep on the couch or lying in a hospital bed, dreaming about his family because they are everything worth paying attention to. The attention is real. It persists. It makes things worth watching. That is why the show is still running, not because the mysteries are unsolved, though they are. Not because the theories are compelling, though they are. Not because Springfield is endlessly fascinating as a subject of analysis, though it is. Because the people in Springfield are worth paying attention to. Because what happens to them matters in the way that what happens to real people matters. Because their love and their damage and their improbable survival and their stubborn persistence against everything the town and the forces within it keep throwing at them constitutes something that resembles the experience of being alive, which is, in the end, the only thing that any story can give you. The feeling of recognizing something true. Springfield is that. 36 years of it, imperfect and yellow and four-fingered and impossible, leaking radiation and resetting between episodes and floating above any fixed geography. Still there. Still paying attention. Still together on the couch. It always is. There is something about Sunday night specifically that the show has always understood and that the show has always traded on, even when it did not comment on it directly. Sunday night at 8 o'clock was where The Simpsons lived for the majority of its broadcast history. This is not an incidental fact. Sunday night has a specific emotional texture in American life, a feeling that is distinct from any other night of the week and that almost every American adult recognizes instantly when they feel it. The particular combination of the weekend ending and the week beginning, the small contraction of possibility that accompanies the closing of the days when obligations are minimal, the specific quality of the late Sunday afternoon light before it gives way to the evening. Sunday night feels like the edge of something, the edge between what was and what is coming, the edge between the freedom of the weekend and the structure of the work week, the edge between who you are when nobody is watching and who you have to be when everyone is. The Simpsons occupied that edge. It was the thing you watched when the weekend was ending, and its specific combination of comedy and genuine emotion and the warm familiarity of characters you had been watching for years or decades was exactly calibrated for the emotional state that Sunday night produces. You were not quite in the mood for the demanding engagement that harder material requires. You were not quite ready to admit that the week was coming. You wanted something that felt like home without being real enough that it could disappoint you. Springfield was that. It was Sunday night's town. It was the destination for the specific small homesickness of Sunday evening, the place you could go when the real world was reasserting itself and you needed a few hours before fully returning to it. This is not a small thing. This is not just a scheduling fact. The emotional resonance that The Simpsons has accumulated over 36 years of Sunday nights is embedded in the experience of watching it in a way that makes the show inseparable from the feeling of Sunday evening for an entire generation. You cannot fully separate the quality of the show from the quality of the moment in which the show was reliably experienced. They have grown together, the show and the Sunday night feeling, until they are each part of the definition of the other. This is why the show is so difficult to evaluate from a distance. You cannot assess it purely as a piece of television, because it is not purely a piece of television for the people who have been watching it for 36 years. It is a Sunday night ritual. It is a home. It is a place you went when you needed somewhere to go that was familiar enough to comfort without being real enough to demand anything. The coma theory gains an additional resonance in this light. If Homer is dreaming, then every episode of The Simpsons is a Sunday night, in a specific sense the night when you are not quite in the world, not quite out of it, drifting in the comfortable halfway state between the weekend's freedom and the week's demands. Homer's coma is a perpetual Sunday evening, a state of suspended animation between one mode of being and another. The dream runs because Sunday night runs because the state that the night produces is the state in which the dream is most natural, and the dream is most natural in the state that the night produces. Every episode of The Simpsons since 1993 is Homer spending another Sunday evening with his family before the week takes him back. He is never quite awake enough to fully rejoin the world. He is never quite asleep enough to stop dreaming. He exists in the space between, watching his family, sustaining the dream, holding on to Sunday night as long as he can. Because Sunday night ends, Monday comes, the alarm goes off and the week begins, and the comfortable suspension between one thing and another resolves into the harder demands of actual life. Homer does not want Monday to come. In his dream, it never does. The sound of The Simpsons is part of what the show is, and it is the part that is most difficult to think about clearly because we have been hearing it for so long that it has become part of the background hum of the culture. Danny Elfman's theme music is one of the most recognizable pieces of television composition in American history. Not the most beloved. Perhaps there are theme songs that people love with more explicit affection. But one of the most recognizable, the specific combination of its opening notes, the particular sonic signature of its orchestration, the way it builds toward the couch gag and the moment of family reunion, These sounds have been embedded in the memory of American television viewers for 36 years at a depth that makes them involuntary. You hear the opening notes of the Simpsons theme, and something happens in you before you consciously process what you are hearing. You are already, neurologically, in Springfield. You are already in Sunday night. You are already in the state of relaxed, comfortable, familiar expectation that the show has been training you to enter for 3.5 decades. This is what great theme music does. It is not just an introduction, it is a threshold. It is the sonic equivalent of the town sign on the highway, the moment at which you shift from wherever you were to Springfield, from whatever you were doing to watching this particular show, with this particular quality of attention. Elfman's theme opens the door, and 36 years of Sunday evenings have made the door feel like home. The voice cast adds another layer to this. The core voices, Dan Castellaneta's Homer, Julie Kavner's Marge, Nancy Cartwright's Bart, Yeardley Smith's Lisa, and the extraordinary range of Harry Shearer and Hank Azaria are sounds that have become as recognizable as the faces of public figures, as embedded in cultural memory as the voices of people you have actually known. When Homer says something, the voice is Homer before the content is Homer. The sound of Homer precedes the meaning of Homer. This is why the show can be watched at low attention and still deliver its emotional content. The sounds alone carry meaning. The specific quality of Julie Kavner's voice contains Marge's particular combination of patience and anxiety and love, in a way that language cannot fully convey. The sounds of this show, heard over 36 years, have accumulated meaning beyond what they explicitly communicate in any individual scene. This is also why the show is effective as background for sleep, which is presumably why you are here. The sounds carry the familiarity without requiring the active engagement. They provide the comfort of Springfield, the feeling of the Sunday night town, the feeling of the family that is always together without demanding that you follow every joke and every plot turn and every carefully constructed callback to an episode from 17 seasons ago. The sounds of The Simpsons are a form of company. They fill the room with a specific kind of presence. And in the particular vulnerable state of approaching sleep, when the defenses are down and the mind is receptive to impressions in a way it is not when you are fully awake, the company that the sounds provide is genuinely comforting. Homer's voice saying something that makes everyone around him laugh. Marge's voice expressing the specific concern that means everything is going to be managed. Bart's voice pushing at something, testing something, proving through the pushing that he is paying attention. Lisa's voice making the argument that needs to be made even when no one wants to hear it. The family is present. The family is together. The sounds confirm it. And as you drift into sleep, as the theories settle into the background and the mysteries relax their grip, and the warm impossibility of Springfield becomes less a puzzle and more simply a place, the sounds remain. Homer is home. Marge is there. The children are their ages. Springfield is everywhere and nowhere, floating above any fixed map, leaking its strange contaminated light into the dark, dreamed and denied and too expensive to die and too beloved to be released. And you are here, wherever you are. Whatever your version of Sunday night looks like, and the show is on, and the family is together, and nothing in Springfield ever really ends. There is a specific reason that Springfield is a good companion for the hours before sleep, and it is a reason that has nothing to do with the theories or the mysteries or the careful analytical attention we have been applying to the town and its inhabitants for the past several hours. Springfield is a place where things work out. Not perfectly, not without chaos and confusion and the specific disasters that are Homer Simpson's gift to the people around him. But they work out. By the end of the episode, the family is intact. By the end of the episode, whatever went wrong has gone approximately right, or has been accepted as the new shape of things, or has been forgotten in the comfortable way that Springfield forgets everything. The ending is, reliably, okay. This is not a small comfort. In a world that does not reliably produce okay endings, in a life that does not always resolve by the final credits, the reliable okayness of Springfield is something that millions of people have found genuinely sustaining across 36 years of Sunday nights. The coma theory would say that this reliability is the point that Homer's dreaming mind cannot produce an ending that is not okay, because an ending that is not okay would be an ending in which the family is not together, and the family not being together is the one outcome his unconscious mind is built to prevent. The radiation theory would say that the reliability is a symptom that a population too cognitively impaired to sustain the attention required for tragedy will always find its way back to the comfortable baseline, always smooth out the disruption before it can develop into genuine consequence. The collective denial theory would say that the reliability is a social agreement that Springfield has decided, through the same mechanism by which it decides everything, that episodes end okay, and the decision is binding, and anyone who insists on a different ending can take the train that Seymour Skinner took. The coma theory would say it is love. All of them might be right, simultaneously, in the way that the best things contain multiple true readings without any single one of them being complete. Springfield ends okay because we need it to. Because we have been letting it end okay for 36 years, and the ending is part of the ritual now, as necessary as the theme music and the couch gag and the sound of Homer saying the word that he says before the credits roll. The family is together, the house is standing, the street is quiet, the cooling towers steam into the dark sky, and the quick E-Mart sign flickers at the empty corner, and the fish in the river have 3 eyes, and the old man glows in the dark, and none of any of it, means that the ending is not okay. It is okay. The family is together. Go to sleep. Springfield will be there when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. The theories will still be there tomorrow. The mysteries will still be unsolved. The cooling towers will still be steaming on the hill, and the safety inspector will still be asleep at his workstation, and the richest man in town will still be getting his weekly treatment, and the baby in the high chair will still be watching everything with those enormous, unreadable eyes. But right now, none of that needs your attention. Right now, the only thing that requires anything from you is the pillow beneath your head, and the slow deepening of your breathing, and the comfortable weight of the blanket as your body settles into the mattress, and the theories fall away, and the mysteries go quiet. Springfield is still there. It will be there when you open your eyes. You have been a good audience. Good night. The theories will still be there in the morning. The mysteries will still be unsolved. The cooling towers will still be steaming on the hill, and the safety inspector will still be asleep at his workstation, and the richest man in town will still be receiving his weekly treatment, and the baby in the high chair will still be watching everything with those enormous, patient, unreadable eyes. But right now, none of that needs your attention. Right now, the only thing that requires anything from you is the pillow beneath your head and the slow deepening of your breathing and the comfortable weight of the blanket as your body settles into the mattress and the loop keeps running and the family stays together and Springfield holds its shape in the dark. It always does. It always will. And in a house on Evergreen Terrace, the family is on the couch. Homer is there, Marge is there, Bart, Lisa, Maggie. All of them together in the only way they know how to be, which is completely and without reservation and with the specific, impossible, enduring love that has kept the show running and kept us watching and kept Springfield standing through everything the world has thrown at it across 36 years of Sunday nights.